It is well known that Goethe possessed the habit of shaping in advance an outline or plan for the works he intended to compose. At times this design was written out with its divisions and subdivisions carefully arranged. At other times it remained within his mind, gradually unfolding into a complete and organic form. His writings, like all great literary creations, are built upon such a structure. They follow an underlying scheme which ultimately becomes so fully realized that it conceals itself. Yet careful study can reveal it, and indeed must do so. One of the primary tasks of interpretation is to bring this hidden structure to light, whether it lies within a single scene, an act, or the entire drama. Along these lines moves the inner framework of the work, through which thought assumes its architectural shape, both in its broadest design and in its smallest detail. What the poet employed in creation may likewise guide understanding. Thus attention is directed to every part of this great construction, as it first existed in the mind of its creator, and any analysis must be grounded upon the same proportions that guided its formation. Thought itself is organic, and poetry shares this nature, possessing a structure that determines the order and movement of its life. A clear distinction, however, must be observed. The scheme to be sought is that of the poem itself, not one imposed from outside through philosophy, theology, ethics, or aesthetics. The aim is to discover the work as it exists, not to fit it into a pre-existing system. No external standard can serve as a final measure. The principles by which it is to be understood must arise from within it. A great poem stands as a primary reality, much like the universe itself. Its first fact is its own existence, which calls for comprehension rather than judgment. In approaching it, one may even find oneself within its scope, rather than containing it within one's own understanding, until its guiding principle becomes clear. Faust possesses such a structure, but it must be found within the work itself. Any outline proposed beforehand remains provisional, to be confirmed only through the completed work. Still, such a guide may offer an initial overview. The first major division of the opening part extends to the scene known as Auerbach's cellar. This section presents the inner conflict of Faust, centered upon the tension between intellect, which denies truth, and aspiration, which affirms it. From this struggle emerges Mephisto, whose development may be traced through several stages. Faust first seeks truth beyond the limits of intelligence, which has already failed him in the established fields of knowledge. His initial attempt turns toward magic, invoking the forces of nature and the spirit of the earth. Both efforts end in failure, as reflected in his first soliloquy, where only the figure of Wagner remains as a residue of his former approach. He then turns toward death as a possible escape, but is held back by the sound of the Easter chime and song. These awaken memories of youth and revive a sense of faith, restoring his aspiration and preventing his departure from life. This forms the second soliloquy and the Easter scene. A shift then occurs in his direction. Drawn outward by the festival, he encounters the sensory world, which suggests a different path. If the search for truth through intellect proves fruitless, that same faculty may be redirected towards satisfying desire. At this point, Mephisto begins to take form, representing intellect in the service of the lower nature. This development first appears in the figure of the poodle, an animal form associated with cunning intelligence directed toward instinctive ends. From this arises the figure of Mephisto himself, who passes through various shapes, at times appearing as a beast, at times as a learned figure, and at times as a guide toward pleasure. His transformation culminates in a completed form, at which point he enters into an agreement with Faust. He offers to satisfy the longing for truth through the gratification of the senses within this life, claiming Faust thereafter. With this, Faust's earlier purpose is set aside, and he follows Mephisto into the world shaped by such a vision. The conflict, once entirely internal, now moves into a broader sphere, marking the conclusion of this stage. From the outset, the work presents itself as a reflection upon culture and civilization, revealing the destructive potential that can arise within knowledge itself. Faust appears as a figure of immense learning, one who has received the highest gifts of education, yet finds his spirit diminished by them. This destructive tendency is not unfamiliar, for it emerges within the very progress of modern thought, giving rise to forces that threaten both individual and collective life. When knowledge fails to nourish the inner being, it may drive the individual toward mere sensation and indulgence. The course of such a life, reflecting a deeper condition of the age, now unfolds in its negative movement, yet this process is not without resolution, for the same soul that wanders is also capable of correction through its own experience. The initial stage of this inner conflict begins with a profound denial, an absolute negation, and portrays the effort to overcome it through means other than conventional knowledge. The central theme of the opening soliloquies lies in this struggle, expressed as a powerful alternation between aspiration and negation, a continual rising and falling within the soul. The opening lines of the first scene immediately present the central theme of the poem. A long devotion to knowledge has produced an intense inner conflict, a profound struggle within the man himself. The opposing forces in this conflict are the intellect, which denies the possibility of knowing truth, and the deep longing of the heart that still reaches toward that truth. Faust appears as a man no longer young, one who has spent his most passionate years immersed in the accumulated learning of the past, preserved within the four great faculties of the German university: philosophy, jurisprudence, medicine, and theology. The result of his earnest and prolonged effort is the conclusion that nothing can truly be known, nothing within these vast domains that claim to encompass all knowledge. More precisely, he arrives at the conviction that man cannot know truth. Through study he has not only failed to know, but has come to know that he cannot know. Yet this realization only intensifies the torment within him, for his heart burns with desire to grasp the very truth that his intellect denies. His outer life reflects this inner failure. In pursuing knowledge so fruitlessly, he has sacrificed everything, possessing neither wealth nor property, neither honor nor worldly recognition. His condition is one of poverty and obscurity. Even his profession is hollow, for he teaches others what he himself does not understand. His bitter cry that no creature would wish to live such a life expresses a deeply human anguish. What stands before us is the problem of knowledge in its fullest intensity. Faust has reached the point where knowledge turns against itself, denying its own power. The intellect, like a disordered parent, rejects and destroys its own creation. This issue belongs to philosophy, yet it also belongs to poetry. Both share the same content, though they differ in form. A philosophical work would present the matter through abstract propositions, but the dramatic poem reveals it through a living individual in action. Here, a man is shown possessed by the idea that truth cannot be known, and he follows this conviction to its ultimate consequences. Thus, the poem carries a philosophical theme, the fundamental problem of knowledge, yet it remains a poetic creation, expressing thought through the living movement of a human life. In this way, the great denial of Faust is made present before us, a denial that contains all others. It recalls the ancient image of a power that consumes its own offspring, for this knowledge destroys itself. If truth cannot be known, then nothing enduring can be recognized. No law, no moral order, no institutions, no science, no God can retain validity. The entire spiritual world collapses into chaos under such a negation. Yet this sweeping denial must eventually turn upon itself. Carried to its extreme, it must negate its own negation. That development, however, lies further ahead. This universal no already lives within Faust as the seed of Mephisto, the germ from which the devil will emerge into separate existence. The unfolding of the poem follows this initial negation and the struggle to transform it into affirmation. The form of the work arises naturally from this condition. It begins as a soliloquy, a man speaking to himself, unfolding his own inner division. Though it is a drama, it is first a drama of the soul, where dialogue and action occur within a single being. For Faust, no external world can hold true reality if knowledge itself is denied. Thus, he can only converse with himself. The outer world stands as something inaccessible, closed off to genuine understanding. Yet from within himself, he will bring forth figures with whom he can engage. His thoughts, in their different tendencies, will take shape as distinct characters, each moving independently. This marks a new and unusual method. The poem begins with a kind of spiritual genesis, where inner forces become outward forms. In this way, the opposing elements of Faust's nature are revealed. While his intellect insists that knowledge is impossible, his longing to know grows ever stronger and demands fulfillment. This longing is the hidden force driving him forward, compelling him to overcome the negation born of intellect. He feels that he must know, even as he believes that he cannot. These opposing movements create a restless oscillation, pulling him between extremes. Yet both arise from the same source, knowledge itself, for in denying knowledge, he must still exercise it. Even in claiming that he cannot know, he affirms knowledge in the very act. The denial contains an unconscious affirmation beneath it. Thus, whenever the force of negation appears, its counterpart, the impulse toward knowledge, must also arise. They exist together, inseparable, like two opposing yet connected powers. Faust is caught between them, lifted at one moment toward the highest aspiration, then cast down into the deepest denial, until he can reconcile this division and bring it into unity. Of this Faust-like structure, the movement of the poem may be traced as if one were following a great living tree. Its two main branches have already been explored downward to a common taproot, which sinks far beneath the light of heaven into the dark earth. There it gathers its primitive nourishment, and through hidden channels sends life upward into every limb and leaf, so that the whole tree may flourish in the upper light, expanding into blossom and fruit. The reader is not meant to avoid this descent into darkness, into the deepest foundations of the poem, for such an investigation is necessary if the entire organism is to be understood. One must indeed burrow beneath the surface, as the true root of anything never remains in the sunlight. Yet it is not wholly hidden, for it may be approached through another illumination, the light of thought. If this primordial fact is considered again, it becomes clear that the denial of truth contains within it the aspiration for truth. Both exist together, the one in conscious intellect, the other in unconscious feeling. Each presupposes the other, like the positive and negative poles of a single magnet, and each continually calls forth and passes into the other. The movement between these two poles will rise and fall throughout the entire poem. They are the two aspects of a single reality within the human soul, and because of this, the soul retains the possibility of salvation if it strives sincerely and earnestly. In its very nature, the human spirit remains fundamentally optimistic. At the height of its intensity, denial itself generates aspiration, and aspiration, being a fragile inner impulse not yet supported by intellect, is in turn overthrown by denial. Yet if the struggle continues to its end, aspiration ultimately prevails. It storms even the fortress of intellect and drives out denial, which had entrenched itself there. Pure denial, however, without aspiration, is no longer Faust but Mephisto, not man, who is essentially an optimist, but the devil, the ancient pessimist, destined to be consumed by his own inner fire. The very force of Faust's denial arises from the intensity of his longing for truth. If he did not care for truth, there would be no need to deny it so persistently or so bitterly. In fact, without such longing, the question would not trouble him at all. Possession brings rest, but absence awakens desire. These are the two sides of the inner conflict that the poem portrays, as if recounting a long, shifting struggle through life itself. The desire for truth continues to burn even in the presence of denial. Faust therefore seeks a new means of attaining his aim, and this new means is magic, which now becomes for him a fifth discipline, replacing the four traditional faculties that have already failed before the drama truly begins. Through magic, it is believed, spirits may reveal immediately what intellect cannot discover through thought alone. To control the realm of spirits and compel them to reveal the ultimate secret becomes his new endeavor. The moon, imagined as a magical lamp suspended in nature, first draws him out of his confined study, his world of books and dead learning, through which faint traces of light from heaven fall like through stained glass. He rises into a realm where a different vision of truth becomes possible. He leaves behind this lifeless scholarly world, the Wagner-like element within himself, and moves toward nature, seeking to hear her voice as one spirit speaks to another. Yet even in this turning away, he is still guided by a book, now a book of magic, associated with Nostradamus, the well-known figure of occult science. Thus he must use a book to escape books, showing how deeply the scholarly impulse remains within him. This fifth discipline, called magic and practiced in various forms since the Middle Ages, represents humanity's attempt to penetrate the mysteries of existence not through reasoned thought but through hidden forces awakened by ritual. In its medieval form, it carries an alchemistic character, where transformation of substance is mirrored in spiritual transformation. Words and rites are believed to summon invisible powers and give form to the unseen. With the four faculties having failed, the desperate seeker turns to this fifth and hidden path. The soliloquy now moves into the moment where Faust attempts to address the spirits directly, not through free nature but through his book. These spirits appear in two forms, the nature spirit and the earth spirit, one governing the forces of nature, the other active in human life and action. Twice he rises toward apparent communion with them, and twice he falls away, struck down by his own denial, which drives the spirits from him. Thus the pattern is set, 2 ascents and 2 descents, shaped by the twin forces that propel him, aspiration and negation. Faust opens the book and beholds the sign of the macrocosm, which appears, in his description, as a radiant outflow of divine light passing through all lower realms of nature down to the elemental, like a sun illuminating the whole chain of existence. It is an oriental conception, present in the Kabbalah and other mystical writings. The idea that all existence is connected by a living net of reciprocal influences, moving from above to below and from below upward, had already fascinated him in his youth and remained with him throughout his life in changing forms. Both his science and his poetry rest, in part, upon such a unifying thought, and it is characteristic that he early cherished a magical treatise known as Aurea Catena Homeri, in which nature is bound together, even if in a fanciful way, as a golden chain. This image of a linked and living nature, first seen as a youthful dream, is something he will strive throughout his life to elevate into the reality of scientific understanding. The sign of the macrocosm, suggesting these harmonies of nature, seizes Faust and awakens his powerful aspiration. For a brief moment his inner conflict seems resolved. Hidden forces appear to open before him, and in his vision he feels almost like a god, as though the spirit world is not closed. He describes this perception of the macrocosm in elevated and delicate language. Each thing takes its place within the whole, receiving and transmitting energy. Celestial forces rise and descend, connecting all things as if by golden vessels flowing from heaven through the earth, sounding their harmony throughout the universe. It has been suggested that this image may recall a Manichaean conception in which souls are carried back to the source of light in vessels of ascent. Thus he rises, under the influence of the magical sign, into an apparent vision of truth, driven entirely by aspiration. Yet this very aspiration will call forth its opposite. He strives to know, only to discover that what he knows is still only striving. A sudden disillusion breaks through his words. What a show, but alas, only a show. There is no ultimate reality in it, only thought, only his own thought. The denial rises like a force within him. He cannot know that this is truth. What appears as truth is merely a subjective illusion. Still, Faust struggles to hold fast to the breasts of nature, as though they might sustain him with living nourishment. Yet this is not granted to him, for a man burdened with such negation cannot remain there. The nature spirit fades from his reach, and he descends to the point where return must begin, where denial begins to consume itself, since to deny, one must in some sense still know what is being denied. The longing for truth, however, remains unbroken within Faust. He will not surrender it easily. The force of his descent only intensifies the power of his upward aspiration. Once more he opens the mystic book of knowledge and beholds the sign of another spirit, the earth spirit, to which he feels closer as a human being than to the nature spirit, since this one encompasses humanity itself. His aspiration is renewed. He dares to enter the world, to experience all that belongs to earthly existence, every joy and suffering, for only through such participation can he hope to enter into communion with the spirit that governs earthly life. He rises to a state of intense spiritual exaltation, his entire being surrendered to the vision, exclaiming, thou must, though it cost my life." At this invocation the earth spirit appears, unlike the nature spirit, not as a mere inner thought, but as a visible presence with form and voice. It appears as a shape of flame, a consuming fire that destroys all finite existence and now threatens Faust's fragile individuality. The mortal and limited being is overwhelmed by this terrifying vision of the infinite, which addresses the cowering worm with a tone of world-consuming irony. Yet Faust asserts his spiritual dignity in response. "I am Faust, I am thy peer." The question arises, what is this earth spirit? A faint indication of its meaning has already appeared. It represents the soul of all earthly activity taken as a whole. Now it expresses itself in a strange, ancient, and mysterious voice, like occult runes through which its nature becomes partly visible. No precise definition is to be expected, nor would it suit the restless striving of Faust, who perceives this apparition. Still, some understanding is possible. In its opening words, "In the floods of life, in the storm of deeds roll I up and down," there is already a suggestion of the spirit of history and human action. It is the principle behind the movement of countless human beings across the earth, each pursuing individual aims, yet forming part of a larger unity. This I which moves through the storms of existence is a spirit, even a personality, active at the center of earthly becoming. It should not be removed or dissolved, for it carries the meaning of the whole. It is the enduring force within all change, weaving on the roaring loom of time the outer form in which divinity appears. All events, wars, revolutions, and individual actions are transformed by it into what may be called the living garment of God. This is the spirit whose voice Faust has momentarily heard. A grand appearance, indeed, yet the question remains whether Faust has truly attained the truth he has been seeking. In his exaltation he believes so, and even dares to declare, "How near I feel to thee, busy spirit, who dost enclose the wide world at a sweep." This is a lofty sense of fellowship with the spirit of the world, but it inevitably calls forth the opposing spirit, the hostile demon of denial. The mighty semblance is still before him, and seems ready to speak, yet its answer strikes with sudden force. "Thou art like the spirit thou comprehendest, not like me." And then it vanishes, not through any external force, but as if dissolved by its own utterance. But what does this strange reply truly mean? It means, like what thou comprehendest, not like reality itself, like thy own conception, not like the thing, like thy thought, not like that which is. The answer is therefore Faust's own reflection turned back upon him, the voice of denial answering aspiration. Into the colossal figure of the earth spirit, born of Faust's highest striving, denial has entered and delivers its crushing verdict. This is the ancient skeptical doubt reappearing. Man cannot know truth. What he sees is only a subjective phantasm of his own making. No wonder, then, that the earth spirit dissolves into thinnest air, recognized by Faust as his own illusion struck down by its own denial, and he is once more plunged into a sudden descent into dismal depths. Yet Faust remains, still yearning, still questioning. "If not thee, whom am I like?" At once a knock is heard, and the answer enters in living form. He is like the one who now appears before him. His famulus, indeed, he answers it himself. "Death, I recognize it. That is my famulus." What stands before him is the emptied image of himself, Wagner, the famulus, the pedantic schoolmaster, the dry husk of erudition. Thus Faust has twice risen through aspiration into a vision of truth, and twice fallen away through denial. First the nature spirit, soul of the physical universe, appeared and vanished. Then the earth spirit, soul of human activity, rose in imaginative power into speech and form, only to disappear at a thunderword, leaving behind Wagner. This scene, often traced to Goethe's early formative years, already contains the germ of the Faustian problem, a germ destined to unfold over decades into a full poetic universe. All life, experience, and history are to be gathered into this unfolding, until the movement of an entire human race is mirrored in a single man in this sense. The individual is called to universal consecration. From this point a glance into the future becomes possible. Faust has seen, in the earth spirit, a fleeting image of what he is to become. He is destined to be the active principle of the earth, helping to weave the garment of God. He will rise again from denial into aspiration. He will yet comprehend the earth spirit and, in a deeper sense, become it. But for now he is Wagner, the mere pedagogue of pedagogues. So far as any true reality is concerned, at present the earth spirit, as projection of his aspiration, carries denial within itself from the beginning, being only the object of longing opposed to intellect, but when one day it is realized through intellect, it will endure. Aspiration alone can call forth the earth spirit, but cannot hold it. Wagner now appears, as if generated out of Faust himself, at the moment when the earth spirit collapses under its own denial. The fullness of vision is gone, and the dry, creeping reality of pedantic knowledge intrudes upon Faust's grand experience. Wagner is thus linked both to Faust and to the earth spirit, the latter without its living soul, reduced to soulless knowledge of the past, the former as mere student of dead learning, without either aspiration or denial in creative tension. He represents the formal residue of study, emptied of life. Yet Wagner is also himself, not merely a fragment of Faust. As Shakespeare is all his characters, and yet remains Shakespeare, so Wagner is both an element of Faust and a distinct being. The two truths are not contradictory, but unified at a deeper level. It takes all his figures to make up Shakespeare as Shakespeare. Likewise, Wagner is what he is because he is drawn from Faust's own being. This genetic connection must not be lost, nor the character's reality denied. The lesson is severe. If truth cannot be known, and the earth spirit cannot be attained, then nothing remains but Wagnerhood, the barren state of learned existence without living spirit. The first utterance of Wagner strikes his keynote immediately. The anxious outcries of Faust, as he struggles to reach and keep the earth spirit, Wagner interprets as the declamation of a Greek tragedy, some ancient, learned theatrical affair, from which he also wishes to profit somewhat. This is precisely his own realm, erudition. Beyond that, he is concerned with improving his elocution and insists on the necessity of a proper external delivery for the orator. This opens the way for Faust to emphasize feeling, heart, spontaneous utterance, and the internal requirements of truth. His aspiration asserts itself absolutely against the formalities of the world. He overwhelms Wagner with a fire of sarcasm, yet Wagner hardly seems to feel it. He continues gathering his dry straws of learning, sighing that he cannot gather them all. "I am still far behind therein," he admits. His deepest sorrow is that before he can become even half-learned, a poor devil must die. In this way Faust reveals the burning intensity of his subjective nature, his aspiration. So strong is this inner fire that he refuses to grant validity to anything outside it. Even his feeling carries within it a form of denial. But now his intellectual negation also breaks forth, turning with almost demonic scorn upon Wagner, who has spoken of putting himself into the spirit of the ages. "No," replies Faust, "the past cannot be known. It is a book with 7 seals. And as for this so-called spirit of the ages, it is your own spirit, gentlemen. It is the same answer given earlier by the earth spirit. Thou art like the spirit thou comprehendest, not like me. Your history is nothing but a swill-tub and an old garret, combined. Your world, and man's heart and spirit within it, Mr. Wagner, cannot be known, and even if it were known, you would not dare to speak it. Those few who have not kept the secret of their hearts, from the beginning on, have been crucified and burned." Such words strike like gigantic blows against Wagner's intellectual fortress. Yet Wagner also has a certain validity, and this must be acknowledged. He retains a belief in an external world of reality, however empty of soul it may be, while Faust possesses only an inward world of intense subjectivity, rich in spirit yet lacking true reality. In philosophical terms, there stands a barren objective world against a full subjective world. If both could be united in one man and one world, it would mark the resolution of the conflict and the end of the poem. But instead, both sides war within the same individual, with his soul as the battlefield, and also outside him, with the world itself as the arena. A historical meaning also lies in this representation. Wagner reflects the German university of the poet's time, with its cold erudition, its Wolffian philosophy, its dry abstractions in science and theology. Faust embodies the fierce protest of the spirit against such empty knowledge, yet this protest itself rises into denial of all knowledge, tearing apart Wagner's world without being able to construct a new one in its place. In a broader sense, another great work born from the same intellectual struggle, the Kantian critique of pure reason, shares this same Faustian spirit. It destroys the old realm of empty abstractions, yet concludes in a denial, even an unconscious denial of itself, like knowledge that knows it cannot know. In this scene, the poetic instrument is fittingly sharp sarcastic humor, which cuts through Wagner without his even perceiving the blow. Yet even Wagner, most pitiful of earth's sons, who searches for treasures but is satisfied with a fishing worm, can still awaken a momentary gratitude in Faust by offering some trace of hope and belief in reality, even if not in the earth spirit. "Thou didst rescue me from despair, which was crushing my senses," Faust admits. And so for a moment he is able to try once more. Wagner's world having been cut to shreds and dismissed, Faust falls back once more into his own inward subjective world, where he is compelled, by necessity, to speak only with himself. For this reason, the form of the soliloquy is taken up again a second time. The first soliloquy rests on the same foundation. It finds Faust immediately after his final study, perhaps theology, when he has reached his universal denial. In that state he seizes upon another and final means of knowledge, magic, but this too has collapsed beneath his negation. It can no more give him truth than the four faculties. From this point onward he will not again summon spirits in hope of knowledge, for one experience has been enough. 3 figures have arisen and been struck down by his sharp-edged no, the nature spirit, the earth spirit, and Wagner. The second soliloquy begins by casting a backward glance at the failed attempt of magic in both its forms, and recognizes the thunder word that destroys it. "Thou art like the spirit thou comprehendest, not like me." This passage helps to clarify more fully the 2 spirits of magic. In the vision of the earth spirit he enjoyed himself, as in a mirror of eternal truth, and through the nature spirit his free energy dared to flow through the veins of nature, even dared to enjoy the life of God's creating. The deeper implication is that Faust himself is the source of these forms. What he saw in the mirror was himself, and what he experienced as divine creativity was his own projecting activity. This second soliloquy, written much later, perhaps a quarter of a century after the first, expands and in a sense interprets it. Yet the burning question remains: what guidance is left now? After being thrown back into uncertainty, shall he still follow aspiration? But all human action and suffering obstruct the free course of life and obstruct that very aspiration. The examples are clear. Worldly prosperity destroys the ideal. Feeling and imagination are dragged from boundless reaches into narrow earthly limits. Care turns every joy into sorrow, making one weep always what one does not lose. Human life thus appears as a continual fall from aspiration into grovelling existence, from the infinite into the finite. Such pessimism is strong here, and readers influenced by Schopenhauer have often seen the entire poem from this side alone, perceiving only the downward movement, not the ascent. The conclusion presses itself forward: "I am not like the gods, who embody realized aspiration untouched by doubt. Rather, I am like the worm in the dust trodden to death by the wayfarer's step." Faust appears as the victim of fate, if he cannot know the truth of the external world and bring himself into harmony with it. For that world exists regardless, and will continue its course and crush him unless he penetrates it with intelligence. He is reduced to the despair of the old fate-stricken Gloucester. As flies to wanton boys, are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Thus he becomes a worm under such a thought. His books and instruments appear as mere dust in which he crawls. The entire past, and all it has transmitted, becomes nothing but accumulated dust upon his shelves. In this way he breaks with his chief inheritance, the unfolding mind of the world in time. He rejects tradition, a motive already present in the first soliloquy, now intensified. At this lowest point of reaction against knowledge, what remains of knowledge if the past is removed? One principle, earn your father's inheritance over again in order to possess it, is distorted into denial, though in itself it expresses a truth. That inheritance is real, yet must be won anew. Faust, however, declares that only what the moment creates has man any use for. Such is his descent into the depths, the greatest thus far, yet his lowest point is always his turning point. As with all earthly things, and with the earth itself, the furthest departure from the sun becomes the beginning of return toward light. A sudden gleam strikes from a flask on his shelf. Poison. It is a product of human intelligence, and for a moment restores his respect for human wit and art, precisely because it is destructive, man's skill turned against man. This suits him, and he resolves to use it upon himself. Even its touch seems to lessen his pain. He breaks through his inner constriction and is carried into the high sea, the limitless prospect of future existence. Imagination bears him away on a chariot of fire toward a new world. He resolves to go forward, to make manhood equal to godhood, no longer trembling before a dark abyss filled with imagined horrors, even if it means flowing into nothing. And so the farewell rises. Goodbye, Faust. This is that mighty aspiration, rising once more from murky depths to the heavens, culminating in the resolve to reach the infinite by casting off the finite, by death itself. He would negate mortal life in order to attain immortality. In the first soliloquy he sought the truth of knowledge. Here he seeks the truth of immortality, born from the same titanic drive toward total truth. To transform the uncertain perhaps of the future into a clear now, he attempts to pass beyond life itself. The earlier limitation of knowledge drove him toward magic, now the limitation of life drives him toward death. He takes down a crystal cup adorned with figures. It suggests joy, a release from the cares of life, but only an earthly joy, that of drink, yet now it will bring a final release, one that includes all others and requires no repetition. He raises it to the breaking dawn. This is courage, the courage of the forlorn hope. Faust is ready to die for truth, not for a truth, but for truth itself, but suddenly there is a sound, Easter bells, and an angelic chorus. The first word of the song brings with it the true healing draught, if only Faust could receive it. Christ hath arisen. There is one who has already passed through this descent into hell before him, who has cast off the mortal and put on the immortal. And the voice continues, joy to the mortal one, such as he is, encompassed by every kind of limitation and defect. This is the chant of the angelic choir descending from above to all mankind. The great revelation is given. There is a rise out of the finite human condition, even a resurrection from death itself. Indeed, in this life there must be a continuous resurrection of this kind, as the final song will show. More than this, there exists a world founded upon this principle of Christ, bearing his name, Christendom. In that world Faust is already living, must live. It surrounds him, has entered deeply into him, and forms the very condition of his present existence, if only he could recognize his own presuppositions. Now this celestial voice reaches him in harmony and restrains him from the final act. He need not seek death in order to reach the truth of immortality. That truth has already been suffered for him, and is already present before him. In a sense, even these Easter chimes have been generated out of him, for they have always been within him through education and religion. Why then do the Easter bells sound precisely at this moment? It seems almost too fitting for the poem, arriving exactly in time to save him from an unhappy end, a fortunate intervention by unknown bell ringers and singers. But what if the chimes had not sounded? That question is impossible. They must sound, and they have sounded for every man in Christendom who has reached Faust's moment of crisis. They are an ever-present reality, and at that final point of struggle Faust must hear them, as must every man. And what do they proclaim? I have died for thee, I have arisen for thee. There is no need for thee to pass through the dark chasm in order to experience this truth. Know it and live. Put away thy guilt and weakness here. Believe in me, thy death I have already suffered on earth, and I can tell thee what lies beyond it. I have revealed all in sacred speech for thee. Return to life, to faith in me, and to works of mercy. Such is the heavenly voice, but from the depths of Faust's own being comes the answer. He has no faith, it has been lost. The Easter songs proclaim the great announcement of the resurrection. They declare the Christendom in which Faust has always lived, even while turning away from it. The Christian song appears here as a choral outburst, short, ecstatic lines of joy and sorrow, faith and doubt, breaking forth into a celestial harmony. Within these lines the rhyme itself bursts in rapid succession. Trisyllabic rhymes appear in close sequence, often only a single measure apart in the angelic choruses. Every word seems to hurry into this symphonic praise. In places, 3 and even 5 such rhymes follow one another in successive short lines of only 2 feet, the briefest possible measure. Language itself, along with the singing spirit, is lifted into continuous concord, while Faust's dissonant world is enclosed within this Christian harmony. The celestial chorus stands in contrast to the earthly choruses of women and disciples, where shadows of earth still pass through the brightness. Here the rhymes no longer follow in pure succession, but alternate, often in patterns of 2 and 3 syllables, still connected to the angelic harmony yet distinct from it. The measure remains short and exclamatory, but less perfectly musical than that of the angels. In both cases, a dissonance of soul corresponds to a certain dissonance of form, and the poet allows the meter itself to reflect the inner condition of the theme. To understand the full effect, the structure must also be seen. The essential thread is the song of the angels, which appears 3 times, at the beginning, middle, and end of the sacred cantata. Its first line always repeats the central proclamation, "Christ hath arisen." This is the glad message from above to mankind. From below comes a double response. From the unbeliever and from the believers, the latter again divided into women and disciples. Thus the whole of Christendom is gathered into this brief song, from the divine voice to its denier, including all humanity in between, even its enemy. At the extreme point of separation stands the unbeliever, Faust himself, who is the first to respond to the heavenly call. His answer comes in long, discordant, wandering speech, yet with a distant and uncertain rhyme that suggests the possibility of eventual harmony within him. The believers rise toward the choral tone, but do not yet reach the height of the angelic music, though they move in that direction. Such are the elements woven into the Easter song, whose movement unfolds in 3 stages, each marked clearly by the recurring chant of the angels, "Christ hath arisen." The opening chant of the angels announces the resurrection as a liberation from all limitation. To Faust, the unbeliever, this sound reaches him at a decisive instant. He is drawn back from the brink of the poison cup. The music does not fully disclose its meaning to him, yet it stirs his aspiration and interrupts his despair, leaving him suspended in questioning rather than certainty. The first response from below comes from the believers, in the chorus of women at the tomb. Their devotion is centered in love for the person, and they cling with deep affection to the symbol more than to the thing symbolized. When they fail to find the body, they are shaken. Christ we find here no more. This is doubt and inner disturbance, yet not a denial, nor the beginning of denial. Again the angelic voice proclaims from above with firm clarity, "Christ hath arisen," answering at once the question rising in Faust and the distress of the women. The earlier song had spoken of Christ freed from mortal limitation. This second proclamation adds that the loving one, through suffering, has attained bliss, becoming both example and promise to humanity. Yet Faust answers more decisively in unbelief. "I have no faith in this resurrection. It is a miracle which reason rejects." Still, the song touches a deep chord within him, awakening memories of earlier faith and childhood feeling. This memory restrains him from the final step. Thus, against his will, the resurrection becomes what saves him. It appeals not to his intellect, but to his aspiration, producing hope against hope. Throughout this moment, the hidden conflict persists. Aspiration rises continually against denial, and appears as a buried form of faith that undermines despair itself. Denial carries, within it, its own instability. The resurrection, in its deepest meaning, expresses this same truth. What is mortal and finite reveals in its own unfolding a self-destructive limit, and therefore points beyond itself toward the non-mortal, the immortal, the most vital reality. Because of this promise, Faust turns back from death. Sound on, ye sweet songs of heaven, the tear flows, earth has me again. He had been ready to die in search of immortality, but the song of resurrection interrupts that act and restores him to life. The second response of the believers is found in the chorus of the disciples, forming the central expression of the Christian message. It speaks of tribulation, and of the deep separation between the exalted Christ and those who remain on earth, still longing for reunion. Their division produces sorrow, but also hope. The chorus of men differs from that of the women. The women cling more to the symbol, while the men long for the living presence of the Master himself, yet both experience doubt and distress. The final angelic proclamation stands above all reply, answering both Faust's denial and the disciples' longing. Unbelief must yield to faith in the resurrection, sorrow must yield to joy, and otherworldly expectation must be transformed into this worldly realization. The Master is not distant, but present in life itself. The disciples are called to reenact his life through love, charity, and active service, feeding the hungry, proclaiming the message, and living its truth in deeds. Liberation is not achieved through death, but through life. Faust, however, has already passed through this stage of faith and rejected it, and therefore it cannot resolve his crisis, which is intellectual in nature. A different path must be found for him, or none at all. This becomes the central question that remains before the unfolding of the poem. The angels differ from the archangels of the prologue in heaven. The archangels contemplate God in his works, while the angels proclaim Christ to humanity and know the ascent to heaven through resurrection. They also know the descent into mortality, though they did not themselves undergo it. In this sense they possess knowledge without experience, yet their song remains one of ascent, an eternal movement toward harmony. Many German critics have condemned this Easter scene as an operatic intrusion into a dramatic situation. Chiefly Vischer, the well-known German aesthetic thinker, has distinguished himself through the force of his attack, even suggesting how the drama should have continued at this point by introducing Mephisto as servant of the earth spirit, leading Faust toward sensual indulgence. But such criticism presumes a fixed external measure by which this poem could be judged. The critic does not possess beforehand the criteria for a world book like Faust. No one does. These criteria must arise from the work itself, which is its own law and the first revelation of that law to humanity. If it is truly an original work, it creates its own standard in the unfolding of its theme. For secondary works, repetitions or imitations of what has come before, external rules may suffice, but such an aesthetic cannot face a work like this. It cannot look upon the sun, still less prescribe how the sun should shine. That sun exists primordially, and must be seen by its own light or not at all. The Easter scene with its music belongs exactly where it stands. It is the decisive fact that cannot be replaced by anything else. Goethe struggled long with this poetic problem. Scenes before and after were already written and printed, yet this gap remained open until the edition of 1808. For more than a quarter of a century, he turned the matter over in thought, attempting to bind a world-embracing vision into the form of verse. What appears here is the result, compressed into a few pages, though carrying immense inward fullness. The rhymed structure of 2- and 3-syllable endings is difficult to render. In the original it flows with ease, yet still bears the trace of its laborious formation. It is thought-laden throughout, and must be so, for this is its proper character. Light, casual fantasy would be inappropriate. Goethe can be a free and effortless singer when he chooses, like a bird on a branch, but the greatness of his highest poetry lies in this. It reaches the heart through the intellect, carrying illuminating thought into the depths of emotional life. The necessity of this Easter intervention is the essential insight. These chimes belong to Faust's deepest nature and have just now sounded, as if generated from within through an inner spiritual process. Yet they also exist outside him, having resounded in the world for nearly 1800 years. They are therefore both eternal fact and ever-present reality, not a mere accidental occurrence. This is an example of the true poetic method, which deals not in dreams but in reality. Two remarks by Goethe help to clarify this passage. The first, from the stage prologue of the drama, has already been noted. It describes the poet's task of calling the individual thing to its universal consecration, which is its eternal meaning. The second, a prose statement cited by Courier, expresses Goethe's principle of symbolism, that the particular must represent the universal, not as dream or shadow, but as living, immediate revelation of the unfathomable. In literal sense, this means that true symbolism is where the particular expresses the universal, not as abstraction or illusion, but as a living revelation occurring within reality. In this sense, a single event such as the ringing of Easter bells becomes, for the attentive spirit, a revelation of the unfathomable, no longer hidden, but disclosed within the real world to the human heart. The entire scene stands as a full example of this principle. The songs of the angels will again be heard at the end of the second part of the poem, bearing Faust's immortal part upward to the heavens. At that final stage, he is reconciled with Christendom above and around him, and in similar musical tones he himself attains resurrection. Yet this does not occur through the path of faith. Another way has been prepared for him, which nevertheless leads to the same celestial goal, if one is willing to think with the poet. This Easter song of the angels is shaped in the manner of ancient church hymns still heard in Germany and throughout Christian lands. Italy likely suggested or confirmed the inspiration, where such chants may still be heard echoing beneath the arches of early cathedrals. Easter itself operates as a release and a promise. It releases nature from the darkness of winter into the hope of spring. It released the world 18 centuries ago from tragic fate and gave it hope. In the same way, it now releases Faust as an individual, sending a new gleam of hope into his darkened study. He may be said to be saved at this moment. The following scene will show him moving outward with renewed aspiration into the world that has been spiritually resurrected around him. The second stage of Faust's inner conflict grows directly from the first, yet takes on a distinct character through the development of Mephisto and the final agreement between man and the devil. The struggle remains inward in essence, but increasingly takes the form of confrontation with an external power as well. The earlier soliloquies present the pure internal conflict of mind against itself, aspiration against denial. Their outcome is that truth cannot be known, not through the four faculties, not through magic, not through death, whose meaning has already been declared to humanity through the resurrection, though this meaning remains inaccessible to Faust for lack of faith. He therefore continues in life, since death offers no gain, yet the aspiration within him remains as strong as ever. Since this aspiration cannot reach truth as its object, it begins to redirect itself. If truth cannot be known, at least enjoyment may be sought, since there is appetite and sense. Here seems something tangible and attainable, yet whether this will satisfy the burning desire of the heart remains uncertain. The experiment must be made, though the same inner oscillations, fluctuations, rises and falls, continue. At this point, a major transition begins in Faust, from the pursuit of knowledge to the pursuit of indulgence. This new direction arises as a consequence of denial, which has already undermined the validity of truth. If intellect proves false, then the senses may be used for pleasure, and so they will be. In this new conviction, the devil is already taking form. Faust steps out of his study into a spring holiday and sees a bright, alluring world. It is the same Christendom that once sounded into him through the Easter chimes. Now it appears before him in both its sensuous and religious aspects, the one of which he will absorb, the other reject. The next three scenes present the stages of this transformation: the origin of the poodle, the emergence of Mephisto, and the contract that places Faust under Mephisto's guidance. The whole sequence represents the unfolding of the evil one into reality within the world. Seen from its outcome and purpose, this scene may be called the genesis of the poodle, a strange beginning for an Easter moment, yet this is the form the event takes when it leaves Faust at its end. Already it has been noted that a world outside Faust has been announced in the Easter chimes. That world, Christendom, now appears in miniature as a German town celebrating the resurrection of the Lord. From this event, the holiday receives its character, its joy, and its festivities, an earthly reflection of the angelic proclamation. Into this world Faust now steps out of his dim study, to see what kind of reality it is and what it offers him in his present condition, carrying within him the denial of that very Christendom on its spiritual side. Wagner accompanies him, the scholarly figure still bound to lifeless learning, from whom Faust has not yet freed himself but will now finally detach. This is their last walk together. Faust observes real life before him, begins to understand what his response to it will be, hears Wagner's dry and limited interpretations, and then dismisses him once and for all. The scene changes in rapid and vivid color, revealing the shifting currents of the mixed crowd, yet two central ideas remain visible beneath the movement of the whole. These guiding realities may be named the sensuous and the religious resurrections, both unfolding before Faust's gaze. He is drawn strongly toward the one and repelled by the other. A new kind of pleasure awakens in him, never felt before, and from it a strange transformation of his inner life begins. This is the foundation of the Easter festival. It draws Faust outward into the world, where he perceives the possibility of a new and varied existence. The people emerge from their narrow and dim dwellings, from cramped streets, from the burden of labor, even from the church's venerable gloom, and move outward into nature. Nature herself appears resurrected from winter's confinement, as spring drives winter back into the cold heights of the mountains, according to ancient German legend, while the earth begins to clothe herself in green. The festive procession is bright and varied, similar to holiday crowds still seen in the outskirts of German cities, and commentators have often linked the scene with places such as Frankfurt and Strasbourg. The outer setting reflects the spiritual meaning at its center. With the spring of nature corresponds the spring of youth and first desire. Young artisans go in search of places where the prettiest girls and best beer may be found. After them come the servant girls, then students, then respectable citizens' daughters, each group following in a fixed social order, observing and judging the others. The festival thus unfolds like a chain of attraction, in which each seeks what lies beyond its reach. The procession then turns briefly towards settled life and even social and political observation. Distant talk of war in Turkey appears, followed by a beggar, both product and parasite of society. Soon the tone shifts again, returning to love through the figure of an old fortune-teller, who promises young women visions of their future lovers. In contrast, Faust's counterpart appears here as an old woman, no longer in the realm of knowledge but of love. Finally, with loud song and triumph, soldiers appear, stormers of fortresses and conquerors of hearts, before moving onward and leaving disruption behind. This is the sensuous form of resurrection. Nature is freed from winter's chains, and humanity is released from labor into the freedom of celebration. Every individual soul experiences a temporary liberation from care, from daily toil, from the confinement of ordinary existence. It is a symbolic rising from the burdens of work and urban life into the open joy of the holiday. Drawn out by the Easter bells, Faust enters this moving crowd and reflects upon what he sees. He recognizes three forms of resurrection: of nature, of the people, and of the Lord, moving from outer to inner depth. In part he shares in this rising life, yet the resurrection of the Lord remains beyond him. He sympathizes with nature and with the people, but the spiritual dimension is lost through his denial. The world appears to him mainly in its sensuous form, and here he feels at home. Here am I a man, dare a man to be. Yet this sensuous joy carries within it the danger of excess and moral crossing, hinted at in the song Under the Linden, where love reaches its highest point of union. That song, in truth, stands as a distant prophecy of what Faust himself will one day experience in the turmoil of the senses. The religious side of the festival, not in outward ceremony, but in the feelings which religion awakens in the human heart, now meets Faust in the figure of an old peasant. There is reverence for the learned man Faust, gratitude for his help during the plague, when he, still a young man, went from house to house ministering to the sick, and a simple piety that looks to the helping God who helped the helper and preserved him through all exposure. These are the virtues shining from the elder people, humble and pure. To them Faust responds with outward piety, carefully hiding the heart of doubt within him. Yet inwardly he rejects their faith entirely. He recalls his own former belief with scorn, and even condemns his own work and his father's aid during the plague as worse than the disease itself, for their so-called remedies raged more violently than the sickness, though their intention was good. He sees how pious feeling in men is poured out in ignorance even upon those who harm them. It appears as an ocean of delusion from which no one can escape. Such, he concludes, is all knowledge, especially the knowledge of medicine, one of the four faculties. With this denial comes another violent inner movement, a swing from exaltation into depression, reaching the extreme of intellectual misery in the thought. What one needs, one never knows, and what one knows, one never needs. This is not only the worthlessness, but the complete perversity of knowledge. Where can a man with such a thought in his heart be rushing, beyond all cosmic order into chaos? Yet at the very moment of this extremity, he turns again, as if at his farthest point, and begins to move once more toward the sun. He turns away from knowledge and back to nature, and at her sight a new ascent begins, aspiration rising heavenward again. The evening glow appears before him, hastening on and calling forth new life. He longs for wings to follow it. Before him is the day, behind him the night. Everything in nature becomes nourishment for his aspiration. The soaring lark, the sweeping eagle, the crane striving homeward over lands and seas, all carrying the soul upward toward the infinite. With this resurrection of nature, her movement beyond her own dead material toward a boundless goal, Faust identifies himself, and in that movement he too feels resurrected. A powerful aspiration rises in oceanic waves from hidden depths toward light, toward intellect, but when it reaches the intellect after great struggle, it is not illuminated but struck down, as by the bolt of Apollo, and falls back into darkness, only to gather itself again and rise once more. When it surges from Faust's heart to his head, it is struck not by light, but by lightning, shriveling and sinking as if dead. Yet beneath this struggle a deeper voice continues. Intellect says, "I cannot know." Aspiration answers, "I can, I must." This unconscious affirmation beneath all denial is the deepest necessity of Faust's being, the indestructible germ within him that will eventually transform even his denying intellect. During this elevated mood, Wagner, the dry and scholarly pedant, speaks to him with unexpected effect. Wagner has accompanied Faust's inner struggles with a cold, lifeless commentary, never understanding the three resurrections of nature, man, and the Lord. He rejects the noisy joy of the people as coarse, cannot grasp Faust's scruples about killing patients with medicine so long as it follows the books and tradition, and cannot feel the exaltation through nature, growing weary even of forest and field and unable to envy the bird's flight. His happiness lies only in being carried from book to book, from page to page, and even heaven seems to him something that opens through old parchment. In contrast with this one-sided existence, Faust begins to recognize the transformation within himself. He sees that Wagner is conscious only of a single impulse and warns him never to seek the other. Looking at Wagner's single-souled nature, Faust becomes aware of his own double existence. Two souls dwell, alas, in my breast, in bitter opposition, one clinging to the earth in desire, the other striving upward toward higher realms. This doctrine of the two souls is ancient, running through religions and philosophies, beginning with light and darkness in nature, continuing in the divided human being of spirit and sense, and reaching its height in the divine and human unity of Christ. The entire Faust tradition is born from this dual vision of the world, which the poem seeks ultimately to reconcile into unity, even bringing good and evil into a final harmony within the whole. The unity of impulse in Wagner stands in sharp contrast to the doubleness of impulse in Faust. Faust's aspiration, once single, now begins to split into two currents, one moving upward toward heaven, the other turning in the opposite direction. The striving to know truth is now joined by another striving, the desire to enjoy the world. He voices a new request. "Oh, if there be spirits," no longer spoken with full certainty after the thunderword of the earth spirit, "let them descend and lead me to a new, many-colored life," meaning the sensuous existence glimpsed briefly at the Easter festival. This is the prayer that prepares for Mephisto. Faust also longs for a magical mantle that can carry him into distant lands, and this too he will receive as a gift from Mephisto. A shift is already visible. The boundless aspiration, struck down by denial, begins to sink toward the senses in search of satisfaction, since truth seems unattainable through it. Whether the senses can truly satisfy the craving for knowledge remains an open question. Wagner, however, will not be left behind in matters of spirits. He knows of them as well, though only from books, and offers his own counterpart to Faust's dealings with the unseen world. The result is a cold allegory of the four winds, imagined as dwelling places of demons. Wagner is not frightened by Faust's invocation, as some have assumed. Rather, he treats it as a learned exercise and contributes his own recitation, sounding like something memorized from scholarship. Taken alone, it has its own value, but its true significance lies in the contrast it reveals. For Wagner, the spirit world is either erudition or decorative fancy. For Faust, it must be real or it is nothing. To Faust, therefore, these spirits must have reality. The appearance of the poodle becomes significant. Could this be one of those airy powers now sent to guide him toward a new, many-colored existence? The instruction is to look at the poodle aright, as though a wrong way of seeing is possible. Wagner, however, sees only a dog, an ordinary creature, nothing more. The same object is perceived through two entirely different modes of vision. The physical image on the eye may be identical, but the inner interpretation diverges completely. A trail of fire flashes behind the animal, suggesting destruction rather than illumination. A subtle magical bond seems to draw the creature closer, as if forming a future fetter, its circle tightening. "Come, poodle, be our companion." The scene appears as a sequence of shifting appearances, but Wagner perceives none of it. To him, it remains simply a dog. Thus emerge two ways of seeing the world, the Faust way and the Wagner way. Wagner's description of the dog, how it growls, hesitates, lies down, and fawns in ordinary animal fashion, could, if interpreted differently, reveal something more. But if he could see in that way, he would no longer be Wagner. The dog might spring into the water for a stick and return it joyfully, yet Faust turns this image into irony. Wagner himself is being described, the learned man retrieving sticks thrown into the stream of time. Faust's sarcasm becomes sharper. There is no trace of a spirit here, only mechanical behavior. Wagner, without realizing it, turns the critique upon himself when he praises the well-trained dog as something even a wise man may admire. The implication is a double mechanism, trained by students who are themselves drilled, reducing everything to habit and instruction. In this way Wagner is effectively undone by his own perspective, no longer a companion to Faust, who now turns toward the poodle instead. Wagner will reappear later, somewhat altered in circumstance, yet fundamentally unchanged. The scene illustrates two fundamental modes of perception. One sees transformation and meaning within the fact. The other sees only the surface and insists nothing more exists. These are also two kinds of readers. One recognizes depth within the image, the other sees only a dog and denies further significance. Such divisions will always exist in relation to this scene, to this poem, and to every great work. The metamorphoses remain invisible to the Wagner-type mind, buried in mechanical learning, unable to lift the individual fact into universal meaning. Goethe, the grand liberator of the human spirit, had more than enough difficulty with the drilled minds of his age, especially the learned professors who could not grasp his genetic view of nature, nor perceive her transformations unfolding directly before their eyes. In despair, he once exclaimed, "I expect the learned man to abjure his five senses." His studies on the metamorphosis of plants and animals remained for years neglected and rejected, because the professorial Wagners could see only a poodle and nothing more, often declaring, in a tone meant to be polite yet filled with pity, that it might simply be a case of ocular deception. They even suggested, as a remedy, that one should take their eyes instead. In the same way, the genetic unfolding of this poem would be ridiculed and denied by the Wagners who guard the critical fortress, seeing only the poodle and nothing more, and from their elevated position dismissing it as mere ocular deception whenever the deeper meaning is pointed out. Goethe, in this scene, allows himself a subtle, almost hidden laugh at such scientific and literary opponents, though they would not even understand the object of his laughter unless they perceived something beyond the poodle itself. At this point, the reader is drawn into a more personal reflection. There are always voices of Philistine criticism shouting ocular deception at such interpretations, or resorting to harsher language in print. More troubling still is the attitude sometimes encountered, that it would be preferable to remain a Wagner who sees nothing but a poodle than to become a Faust with vision, or at least with aspiration toward the essence of things. This reveals a troubling aspect of human nature, yet it must be passed over in order to continue. For Wagner is now effectively gone, having removed himself through unconscious self-annihilation. Attention must return to Faust, who is once again alone and intent on discovering the kernel of the poodle. The interest must follow him closely, for the signs already indicate unusual developments. In the previous stage the poodle was generated. Now Mephisto is to be generated from the poodle itself. Faust had left the Easter scene with two souls in his breast, and one of these seems gradually to detach itself, strangely taking the form of the poodle. The unfolding of this figure through successive stages into the fully formed Mephisto, no longer an inner figure but an external devil in the world, is the governing idea of the scene. Transformation is the governing method here, not in the smooth classical manner, but in a strange and often grotesque Germanic style, yet nothing is arbitrary. Everything is sustained by deep significance. Forms dissolve into one another in astonishing ways, and the reader is compelled either to follow their inner meaning or dismiss them as madness. The genetic principle dominates this scene more clearly than any other. It cannot be understood unless one enters the creative current that flows through all these changing forms. For clarity, 5 stages of transformation may be distinguished, though their borders are not always sharply fixed. At the outset, the old struggle reappears in new form, with its familiar rises and falls. The fundamental tones of aspiration and denial are still present, and the soliloquy returns as Faust's inner dialogue with himself. In earlier stages, the first soliloquy showed the striving toward truth or science, the second toward immortality, and now the third reaches toward God, from which emerges its negative counterpart, Mephistopheles. This aspiration takes on a religious coloring, preserved throughout much of the scene. It is the impulse brought from Easter, especially from the choral songs, which still echo within him. Of the two souls in conflict, the better soul awakes, and the wild desires go to sleep. The sensuous suggestion of Easter is momentarily subdued, and even the love of man and the love of God begin to stir. The tone is at first soft and harmonious, almost celestial, but it is interrupted by sudden discord. The poodle becomes restless, running back and forth and sniffing at the threshold as if seeking escape, and even the thought of divine love seems to disturb it. The animal is briefly calmed, and the heavenly tone returns. Aspiration moves forward through darkness with its lamp. Hope extends its hand, reason begins to speak, and a deep longing for the source of life, for God, arises. Yet the poodle snarls again with a bestial sound, now no longer easily subdued. The Easter feeling of contentment flows no more. The inner stream suddenly dries up, and Faust lies again, prostrate in thirst, within a barren desert of spirit. Mere aspiration, therefore, cannot save him. He must move beyond feeling into knowledge, and at this stage into knowledge through revelation. Pure sentiment does not lead to God. Instead, one must seek the divine utterance about itself, which nowhere burns worthier and fairer than in the New Testament. This becomes the new path suggested by Easter itself, the word of revelation, which Faust will translate from the sacred original into his own living German speech. The translation Faust produces from his own hand is not, as might be expected, a verbal rendering in the manner of Wagner, but a translation into life itself, into German life. In this way, the inner emotion of religion and of Easter rises into expression and becomes a reality that may prove both lasting and helpful. There is no lingering over external or secondary matters of the sacred writ. Instead, Faust turns immediately to the ground text of the whole book. This is the Logos of St. John, perhaps the deepest thought in the New Testament and therefore the most difficult to translate. Yet Faust must take precisely this passage and no other, not out of a sophistical or negative impulse, but because it is the only answer to his question. Whatever its precise interpretation, it seeks above all to declare what God is to human beings. That is the central concern of religion, and Faust is reaching for it. The translation itself proves unusual, moving through uncertainty but gradually gaining strength. It passes through 4 distinct phases, corresponding to stages of human culture and understanding. In fact, the attempt reflects what may be called a modern scaling of the heavens, an effort nothing less than a definition of God the Creator and his realization in life. The process begins by rendering logos as word, a translation that, in its external sense, resembles Wagner's manner and is immediately rejected by Faust. It then becomes meaning or sense, but this appears too passive. To it he adds force, which seems to lack spiritual depth. Finally, he translates logos as deed, and this is the true Faustian interpretation. In this form, the New Testament and God himself are to be understood as action, as living activity. In the original Greek, logos carries an unusually broad range of meaning, spanning the extremes of human expression. It signifies both reason and word. As Hegel observed, it is a beautiful ambiguity, uniting reason and language. It has also been noted that these 4 interpretations correspond to major philosophical systems. Jacob Boehme describes the word as the beginning of all essence, as the outbreathing of God. Meaning may recall Plato's ideas, force may suggest Aristotelian energy or modern scientific conceptions, while these associations, though interesting, are not essential. The key point is that the New Testament is being transformed by Faust into the realm of deed. No mere word will suffice. At this moment, however, resistance appears. The poodle reacts more violently than before, as if disturbed by this final translation, barking and howling without restraint. Faust attempts to drive it out, but cannot. Instead, it grows into an enormous creature, a monstrous hippopotamus with fiery eyes and terrible teeth. The poodle itself seems to be undergoing a translation of its own, transforming into a colossal beast in direct opposition to the translation of Scripture into deed. Thus, the attempt to reach truth through revelation has produced an unexpected result. The humble animal has become a powerful and threatening form that cannot be controlled by ordinary force. This marks the first transformation within the scene. In the Gothic chamber of Faust, a new and strange presence has emerged, posing its own problem. What essence lies within this creature? To what realm does this half-hellish being belong? A test must now be applied, first using the spiritual symbols of the ancient world, and if that fails, then those of the modern world. Each tradition offers its own system of symbolic forces, which are now to be brought to bear on the mysterious form before them. Faust, therefore, no longer relies on bodily strength but calls upon his spiritual power, the force of exorcism, in order to draw out the true nature of the creature before him. For this aim he once again requires a book. As earlier he used Nostradamus to summon spirits, he now turns to the Key of Solomon, the figure of Oriental magical wisdom, regarded in ancient tradition as the wisest of men, in Josephus as a conjurer, and in the Middle Ages as an author linked with writings on the black art. Through Gothic imagination, the Hebrew sage has thus been reshaped into a magical authority. In this case, the clavicular Solomones is used only to call forth the half-hellish brood, the spirits of nature. They appear, heard singing outside in the passage, yet they cannot enter to assist their companion, the old hell-lynx, who, though allied with them in evil, belongs to a different order, the whole hellish brood. A protective pentagram, the Christian sign placed on the threshold, prevents their passage. It is their boundary which they cannot cross. Still, they wish to help him, for he has previously served their pleasure. Thus they remain outside, circling in response to the key, offering intention without power, since the true conflict is not elemental but spiritual in a Christian sense. 2 acts of exorcism are then directed at these elemental beings. In the first, Faust calls upon fire, water, air, and earth by their spirit names, as though commanding each element to reveal itself. fire to glow, water to flow, air to blow, earth to show its form, if any of them resides within the beast. Yet no response follows, and no physical manifestation appears. Faust recognizes that only knowledge of the elements grants mastery over such forces, and thus the attempt fails. A second invocation follows, even stronger, but again without effect. None of the four elements is present within the creature. Through these scenes, it becomes clear that the phenomenon is not physical but spiritual. The elemental forces of nature, or even the philosophical principles derived from them, cannot constrain the devil, who is not heathen or natural but Christian in origin. The key of Solomon proves ineffective. Faust must therefore turn to another system of symbols, those of Christianity itself, to determine what the beast truly is. If it is indeed a fugitive of hell, it will now resist more openly. The first Christian sign employed is the cross, symbol of sacrifice against indulgence. The creature reacts violently, bristling with hostility. Faust, in a moment of religious fervor, interprets this sign as that of the great sufferer whose blood is poured through all heavens. Yet the transformation continues. The animal grows larger, almost elephantine, while becoming thinner and more vaporous, as though dissolving into mist. Still, the spirit does not emerge. A second sign is then attempted, the threefold glowing light, symbol of the Trinity. This final invocation compels the appearance of Mephisto himself. Opposition to the divine Trinity draws out the fully formed devil, no longer merely animal but now taking human shape, embodying skeptical intellect as well as denial. Thus Mephisto appears as a product of Christianity itself, arising through its negation, first stirred by sensual resistance, then completed in intellectual disbelief. Yet Faust, performing these rites without genuine faith, unconsciously participates in the same denial, and therefore calls forth its corresponding figure. The devil is born where sacred symbols are treated as empty form rather than living spirit. Those Unitarian readers who have set aside the Trinity as a Christian article of faith may feel uneasy at being placed, even indirectly, in the company of Mephisto. Yet they are not to be identified with him. They are widely known as a protest against mummery, having broken away from the older church and becoming, in a sense, a second form of Protestantism, devoted to good works and opposed to superstition, especially to what they call a soulless tritheism or meaningless dogmatic Trinitarianism. Still, the Trinity carries the deepest meaning for humanity. Its difficulty becomes harmful only when it is declared incomprehensible to those who are meant to accept it and live by it. After all distinctions are made, the poet's view of the devil's genesis remains clear. Mephisto is born from the denial of the fundamental Christian doctrine, and is that denial embodied in a person. At the same time, this reveals the basis of Goethe's literary method and the form of apparent magic he employs. It is drawn from reality itself, and remains faithful to its inner logic. The Church had its own magic, gestures, incantations, the real presence, transubstantiation, and continual miracles that believers were expected to accept literally, thereby forming the ground from which superstition and imitation could grow. In response, the Church's magic, by its very existence, gave rise to a counter-magic of the devil, which it then tried to suppress. Though the intention was understandable, the method was inconsistent, since the Church still carried a positive principle of meaning, however distorted, while the opposing magic became pure illusion. Therefore, this literary form of magic is necessary to show the origin of Mephisto. The sacred symbols of the Church are used by Faust as instruments that generate their own negation, reflecting the structure of reality itself. From this point, one may briefly look back at the genetic unfolding of the poem. It begins with the assertion that man cannot know truth. That denial, step by step and with inner necessity, develops into a fully formed figure of negation, the devil himself. The absolute no within consciousness becomes the destroyer, who defines himself in these terms: I am the spirit that denies. At this stage, thought itself shifts, and the literary form moves from magical ritual into metaphysical dialogue, recalling again the intellectual forms once associated with the Church. Mephisto's appearance is also significant. He is dressed as a medieval wandering scholastic, suggesting a theological disputation. This form is not accidental. Just as the cross provokes the animal reaction of resistance, and the Trinity calls forth a reflective, intellectual denial, so the scholastic disguise expresses the rational, argumentative aspect of negation. Mephisto is thus a product of medieval theology itself, but in its negative form, a complete theologian who exists as the denial of theology. In the costume of a schoolman, he is prepared to speak about good and evil in abstract, academic terms, as the medieval schools once did. A final remark is needed concerning interpretation. It is often said that philosophy should not be read into poetry, and in many cases this warning is justified. But when philosophical thought is already present in its own form, the reader has no choice but to recognize and understand it. Great poetry, in fact, often contains philosophy, even if not in abstract expression. In this work, however, abstraction itself appears directly, and is even allowed to take rhythmic form. This is necessary in a poem that aims to present the complete development of a human spirit, and thus also the intellectual history of humanity. Philosophy cannot be excluded from such a structure. The passage concerns one of the most difficult problems, the problem of evil, as spoken by evil itself, attempting to define its place in the universe. It may seem cold and abstract compared to the living poetic movement around it, yet it represents the intellectual core of the work. The reader is warned not to shrink from this metaphysical descent, for to pass through it with understanding is to avoid many later errors and confusions. Mephisto, being firmly summoned and pressed after the second demand, declares his own nature, and this declaration serves as a key explanation of his role in the poem. He describes himself as a part of that power which always wills the bad, but always works the good. It is thus an eternally self-destroying power, one that continually produces its opposite. Evil is thereby defined as something that, in its own nature, turns against itself and becomes self-destructive. In translating this passage, it is important to omit the phrase "not understood," sometimes inserted after power by certain interpreters, since it does not belong to the original and distorts the meaning. This power is not beyond understanding. It is being defined precisely so that it may be understood, even if at first it appears as a riddle to Faust and to the reader. Mephisto continues in a further proposition, "I am the spirit that always denies." He is negation itself, and, consistent with the earlier statement and with later expressions, he represents negation carried to the point of self-negation. Yet his destructive impulse remains active. Every created thing is worthy of ruin. Hence, it were better if nothing were created. Passages of this kind have attracted pessimistic readers, who have seen in Mephisto a confirmation of their own outlook, treating him as their representative voice. Destruction, sin, and evil are thus presented as his proper elements, all forms of negation that ultimately turn back upon themselves. This raises a central question. Is evil, in its full scope, self-annihilating? Does destruction ultimately destroy itself? History offers examples that suggest such a pattern. The Roman Empire, often cited as being destroyed by the barbarians, was already internally weakened, carrying within itself the seeds of collapse. The invading forces did not simply destroy a living whole. They completed a process already underway, and in doing so, destroyed destruction itself. In a similar way, major historical upheavals appear as fires consuming exhausted ages, clearing the ground for renewal and new growth. Even catastrophic events sometimes preserve what they destroy. Pompeii, buried in antiquity, survives precisely through its destruction, which paradoxically preserves it. In this sense, destructive forces often turn back upon themselves. If this holds true in history, the same question applies to the individual. Is sin within the human being also self-cancelling? Will denial ultimately deny itself? The poem suggests an affirmative answer. Faust, through negation, is meant to reach clarity. In the prologue in heaven, it is already declared that through all his confusion he will eventually be led toward understanding. Error, when part of a striving human being, becomes a process that cancels itself and leads toward truth. It functions as a form of discipline toward completeness. Even death is not final in this perspective, but part of a larger process of self-development. Yet this does not mean one should seek error deliberately. Rather, error arises within the striving for truth itself. Thus, the complete human being participates in the fundamental structure of the universe, in which destruction destroys itself. This becomes a central promise of the poem. Evil, both in the world and within the individual, is by its nature self-destructive, and this very process becomes the basis for hope and even immortality, understood as the overcoming of death by death itself. Another essential aspect of Mephisto's character is his full self-awareness. He knows what he is and defines himself accordingly. Although he recognizes the good, he chooses the bad, and even knowing that the bad will ultimately be transformed into good, he still carries it out. Critics have sometimes called this unnatural or inconsistent, but within the logic of the poem it is necessary. Mephisto must possess full knowledge in order to be the devil. If he acted in ignorance, he would not be evil but innocent. Therefore he must consciously will his actions, fully aware of their consequences, and perform them out of malice rather than ignorance. Throughout the poem, Mephisto is thus a fully knowing devil. The deepest aspect of his characterization lies precisely in this. He speaks his own definition, making himself transparent in his self-consciousness. Mephisto has now defined himself as a constitutive part of the world order, yet precisely that part which is destined to be overcome. Evil must come to be overcome. This explanation appears in theological form, as is fitting, since the devil now speaks like a scholastic who defines himself through his own thesis. He calls himself a part, not the whole, indeed only a part of the part. It is a doubled and tightly woven riddle in this form. Its meaning can only be grasped when translated into philosophical language. All negation, when carried through completely, becomes self-negative. It is in truth the negation of the negative, and therefore produces the positive. Mephisto, as negation, is only the first stage of this complete negative process, which itself is only a part of the positive whole. Thus he may call himself a part, or even a part of the part, but never the totality. Whether Goethe consciously intended all of this in writing the passage remains open, yet something of this kind is certainly present and cannot be dismissed. The idea is repeated again in a different vocabulary, now expressed through the opposition of light and darkness. I am part of that darkness which brought forth unto itself the light. Darkness, too, is treated as self-destructive, producing its opposite in light. In this way, the thought is connected to some of the earliest human cosmologies, echoes of Hesiod's myth, where day is born from night, possible traces of the Persian teaching of Zoroaster, built upon the struggle between light and darkness, and even the Hebrew account of creation, where God stands behind primordial darkness and speaks, "Let there be light." Modern natural science, too, approaches a similar idea in its theories of cosmic origins, such as Laplace's nebula hypothesis, in which worlds arise from a primitive chaos whose very nature contains self-negation, chaos transforming itself into cosmos. Thus the devil can destroy nothing in the total sense, but only in particular cases, and therefore he still has hope, at least some hope, regarding Faust. He admits that in the physical world, despite all convulsions, storms, earthquakes and conflagrations, land and sea remain unchanged. Destruction cannot ultimately reach them. In regard to humanity itself, he confesses, "How many have I buried? Yet always fresh new blood begins to circulate." It is enough, he says, to drive him toward madness. From the whole his power always rebounds, though he may temporarily strike the part. Therefore he hopes to strike Faust before Faust becomes whole. Yet whether in hope or not, he continues to will the bad. Persistence in evil with full knowledge defines the devil. Of nature, he claims to possess nothing but flame, the consuming force of material things and symbol of negation. Yet even flame consumes itself and disappears, leaving ashes from which new life can arise. This is the remarkable play of the negative, a surface on which sophistry flickers, yet from whose depths truth remains steady and unshaken. Only the eye capable of piercing the deceptive glare can reach the underlying light. Many turn away, seeing only a devilish illusion, and declare the whole to be mere trickery of demons. Yet it belongs to intelligence itself to illuminate this appearance, otherwise it will spread darkness within the mind. Sophistry and truth are twin-born, sharing the same origin, though one has fallen because it was born so high. The distinction must not be confused. This movement of the negative has been recognized by philosophers. Plato, in his dialogues, lets sophistry consume itself within playful yet serious argument. Hegel develops this play of the negative into a universal principle, driving it through all forms of thought and dissolving appearances so that truth may be illuminated through contradiction. Both have at times been accused of sophistry themselves, yet in a deeper sense they show sophistry destroying itself. The poetic work now proceeds on the same theme. After a brief passage into metaphysical abstraction, it returns to its proper ground, the shaping of a human character through action. Faust has now heard the devil define himself, and he rejects this pure form of diabolism. So thou clenchest thy devil's fist maliciously against the healing creative power. He even cautions his companion, better begin something else. Faust, still filled with aspiration, will not be captured by abstract malice in its bare form. Another mode of approach will be required, and Mephisto prepares for yet another transformation. As he attempts to leave the chamber and enter the world, he is stopped. Something resists his passage. A new and strange image now appears, like a Gothic woodcut of the situation itself. The pentagram lies upon the threshold, a five-pointed star that Mephisto cannot pass. This sign has long held a notable place in both heathen and Christian symbolism, reaching back to the ancient Pythagoreans, where it signified health, harmony, and completeness in body, soul, and mind. Its figure carries both an inward and outward symmetry, each side complete and balanced. It can be drawn from any point without lifting the pen, always returning to itself after its wanderings, like a straying soul. It may also be broken into three independent triangles, yet these unite again into a single form distinct from them, offering a symbol, or even a triple symbol, of the three in one. Within it, 5 alphas can be discerned, which is why it was also called pentalpha, a five-fold hint of the alpha and omega, the first and the last. Reuchlin describes it as a spiritual figure of Christ, suggesting that the 5 letters of the name of Jesus correspond mystically with the pentagram, meaning in Greek the 5-letter. Kepler even used it in conjurations against evil spirits. In the Middle Ages it was placed on doors and thresholds to ward off witches, and even the familiar horseshoe above entrances is said to trace back to the pentagram. In this way symbolic imagination has continually worked upon this figure, though above all it served as a magic sign of Christ or of the Christian religion, which is how it appears here in the poem. Once again the question arises what this strange configuration means, for taken literally it seems irrational. The sign stands on the threshold between inner and outer worlds, yet one point remains open outward, allowing the devil to enter, while another point remains intact inward, holding him within once he has entered. Religion, which the pentagram may represent, cannot fully keep the evil spirit out for Faust, since it offers no truth strong enough against his denial, yet it still awakens aspiration and moral feeling that seek to restrain Satan from within. Objectively, the devil may enter through the broken outer point of the pentagram. Subjectively, Faust still holds mastery through the intact inner point. It was the poodle that first leapt in, driven by sensuous impulse, unaware and unconscious. But the fully formed devil cannot now pass out again, for he has been developed within this chamber from the poodle itself. Thus the situation has changed. Yet why does he not escape through a window or some other opening around the pentagram? Because, as the law of devils and ghosts declares, where they enter, there they must also exit. In this way, evil action must be undone. Repentance is only the retracing of the path by which one entered wrongdoing. Devils, too, must follow this rule in appearance, or they cannot leave the situation they have entered. In rational terms, beneath this magical image, negation must return by its own path and negate itself. Entry is free, for it follows will and choice. But once evil is chosen and enacted, there remains only one way out, since even hell has its law. Thus the pentagram reflects Faust's condition after the devil has been generated within him. The forms of magic are again employed and linked to the earlier genesis of Mephisto. The spirit of destruction revealed through the diabolic scholastic had little attraction for Faust. He allowed it to depart, but it could not leave, for the sacred sign of the pentagram barred its exit and held it under control. The sign is broken outwardly, in the denial of truth and religion, yet inwardly it remains intact, where aspiration and feeling still dwell, keeping the devil constrained. It represents the present developed form of Faust's original struggle between denial and aspiration. Feeling alone now restrains the devil, an inward resistance to his malignant nature, but even that feeling is to be undermined, as the devil prepares to appear in a new and more seductive form, that of pleasure, through which he will corrupt the remaining emotional resistance. With this, his fourth major transformation in the scene is completed. Faust refuses to release Mephisto, for the latter has awakened his curiosity by declaring that hell even has its law. In a kind of satanic humor, Faust even asks whether a contract cannot be made with you gentlemen. Such a contract is indeed possible, and what is promised is that which shall be purely enjoyed. Enjoyment becomes the very substance of the agreement. The devil, noticing Faust's interest, pretends to be in great haste to depart, though this apparent urgency is a form of cunning design to stir Faust further through a feigned desire to leave. Faust reflects that one should not let go of the devil once he is caught, for a second capture would not come so easily. In reality, however, it is Faust who is being caught by this retention, while the devil is the one who truly escapes control. It is therefore no surprise that Mephisto is willing to remain, provided he may amuse you with my arts. This becomes his new role, to provide amusement. The question now arises what kind of amusement this will be. The answer comes immediately. It is directed toward the senses. Tender spirits will offer song for the ear and images for the imagination, which are not an empty magic show. Smell, taste, and touch, the whole sensuous nature of humanity, are to be stimulated and enchanted. Mephisto thus captures Faust not through scholastic argument, but by appealing to the senses, the very element that rose within Faust during the Easter experience. When appetites and passions are served, the servant becomes the master. Then follow voices that seem to hover in the air. These voices sing a famous lullaby, in which spiritual awareness is gradually lulled to sleep by seductive images, and the song becomes a descent into sensuous existence. It appears as a sequence of dissolving visions without firm boundaries. Everything turns dreamlike, yet still carries echoes of Faust's Easter vision, now transformed into ethereal memory. Within this song, 5 shifting cloud-like formations may be discerned. First appears a new world of delight, where the dark Gothic arches vanish and open into blue skies with sun and stars breaking through. Second come the inhabitants of this world, heavenly beings engaged in alluring actions, culminating in lovers within a bower. Third are the occupations and landscapes of this realm, vineyards and flowing wines that run like streams into seas. Fourth, winged beings move sunward and toward distant islands, accompanied by song and dance that follow wine. Fifth, aspiration is also present. Some climb heights, others cross seas, all into life, like Faust himself, who longed for such a many-colored existence, and all into love, which is the central reality of this new world. Thus the song, in its drifting imagery, mirrors Faust's inner condition, presenting a sensuous world as the content of his vision. The rhythm of the song reinforces this effect, swaying like a cradle under unseen influence, moving in a uniform lilt that induces sleep, since variation awakens while repetition lulls. Nothing remains fixed. Images flow into one another, and syntax loosens its structure as grammar itself becomes fluid. Words and meanings seem to move freely through each other, producing a gradual dissolution of stability in thought, morality, and language. The ethical world fades into a sensuous dream, and Faust is now asleep. The resistance against Mephisto is quieted, and aspiration is for the moment subdued. Regarding this music of spirits, the poet likely drew inspiration from legend. In an old account, Mephisto presents a magical performance, as if monks were singing, and yet nobody knew what manner of song it was. Even in the 18th century, according to reports, witnesses at which trials claimed to hear a demon music. Goethe transforms all such superstition into a higher artistic form, in which the solid world dissolves into sweet melodies and dreamlike enjoyment. The triumph is marked in the declaration that Faust sleeps, and the new master's command is heard, to plunge him into a sea of delusion. At this point Mephisto can exult, declaring that Faust is not yet the man to hold the devil fast. He will not long be able to keep him restrained by that remaining inner point of the pentagram, which still holds only partially firm. Even this form is not to remain whole. It is now attacked and destroyed, and through this process occurs the final transformation of Mephisto in this scene. He is lord of the destructive element of nature, as he has already defined himself, and therefore he can command the small instrument of ruin, the rat, to gnaw away the obstructing point, especially when it is touched with a drop of oil that makes it palatable. One may indeed say that, within this sensuous dream into which the ethical world has dissolved, the last scruple, lightly oiled with pleasure, is gnawed away. Or it may be said that the inner remaining core of instinct or moral feeling, which survives even intellectual denial, is merged into the dream cloud of pleasure and drifts away. This detail, too, has its root in legend. Mephisto must share in the animal world. Deep in ancient Teutonic and Aryan mythology lies the belief that certain animals are possessed as familiars of spirits, and that vermin such as insects, rats, and mice, along with cats as petty destroyers of nature, belong to the great destroyer and serve as instruments of the devil, a belief still preserved in popular superstition. Mephisto is now free and escapes. Faust awakes, and what remains of his experience is a vague memory, that a poodle sprang from me, thus seeming like his offspring, and that a lying dream brought the devil into my presence. Yet more than this has happened. Faust's last hold upon the devil is broken. Mephisto has slipped out of his control into the world, where he will meet him in the very next scene on equal terms. Faust is now prepared to enter into a contract with him, and Mephisto is equally prepared, skilled as ever in bargaining. If Mephisto's cold, destructive side, expressed in the dry speech of the scholastic, repelled Faust, his sensuous aspect, appealing to pleasure, first interests him, then charms him, and finally lulls him into sleep. But the ground has already been prepared. This is the phase that has been forming within Faust since the Easter festival, when he looked again upon the sensuous world with broken faith. Now nothing stands in the way of his swift descent into indulgence, not conviction, scarcely even moral feeling. In this soothing dream of the senses he glimpses loving stars and rapturous bliss, a prophetic vision that will later be fulfilled in his life. The devil is no longer confined within, but has become a real force in the world, where he must be resisted anew through struggle and suffering. The root of all this lies in the original denial of truth to man, yet Faust still carries aspiration, which prevents him from entirely sinking into the sea of delusion. Thus the movement of the scene may be grasped as a sequence of 5 transformations of Mephisto, the principle of evil. First, he appears as the poodle, growling at the translation of the New Testament into deed. Second, he becomes a monstrous animal, swelling in hostility toward the cross and the Trinity. Third, he appears as the travelling scholasticus, the devil as theologian, defining himself as devil and taking himself as his own thesis. Fourth, he becomes the provider of sensuous enjoyment, producing spirit songs and sensual dreams that end in sleep. Fifth, he emerges as the free devil in the free world, able to bargain on equal terms with Faust or anyone else. The whole process shows that once truth is denied and cut off from the soul, goodness is lost with it, leaving only the purely animal residue of human nature and the pursuit of sensory gratification. All renunciation, self-sacrifice, and faith appear as illusion. The only certainty seems to be appetite, the world as something to consume and enjoy. Intellectual skepticism thus becomes the path to sensual indulgence. Man begins as an animal in instinct, but if he also becomes a devil in intellect, then both animal and devil unite in shared excess until they would consume the world itself. Not only food and drink, but also woman, society, and the institutions of civilization are drawn into this consuming impulse, threatening a universal orgy of destruction. Such a descent, it is feared, lies ahead if the theme is carried to its full consequence. The use of the ancient Faust myth in this scene is especially significant, offering insight for poetry in every age. Almost every incident can be traced to older Faust traditions, yet each is transformed and filled with modern intellectual and spiritual meaning. In the legend, Faust is accompanied by a strange dog called Prestigia, related to the hellhound of German folklore. He also sees a shadow of the devil moving about the stove, as the poodle does here. When conjured, the spirit sometimes takes the form of a man and sometimes of a bear, suggesting the animal metamorphosis now witnessed. Yet what was once grotesque Teutonic imagination becomes illuminated by deeper spiritual significance, so that its roughness fades into a kind of radiant dawn while still retaining its Gothic character. In the legend as well, Mephisto appears in ecclesiastical form, sometimes as a monk, while Faust himself is both a travelling scholar and a student of theology. The poet interprets the mythos into his own time and thereby transfigures it. He preserves its outlines while unfolding it into a new world that lay unborn within it. He perceives what the mute, blind spirit of the people expresses in its dark mythical distortions, and lifts it into harmony and beauty. The mythos is almost voiceless, almost senseless, until the poet takes possession of it, as something granted by divine right, and gives it true utterance, transforming it from the babble of infancy into the song of the ages. Yet the poet cannot create it from nothing. Just as no wheat crop can arise without seed corn, so the mythos must be given to him by his age, his people, and his race. The poet is also an interpreter in his own way, indeed the greatest interpreter of the mythos. Yet even his word may itself require interpretation when it has been dimmed by age, translation, or human limitation. Hence the extended commentary on this scene, which must necessarily be prolonged further. It has been repeatedly observed that Mephisto is developed within this scene. Its most striking feature is evolution, which thus becomes a literary method elevated from nature into spirit. Much uncertain talk arises in the present age about the influence of modern science on poetry, about evolution entering literature and producing a revolution there. Yet this is already fully present. Poetry, as so often, preceded science on the wings of imagination and announced its coming. The dream of one age becomes the reality of the next, and the poet again appears as prophet. Schelling rightly observed that this poem was sufficient to rejuvenate science in its age, for such a rejuvenation has indeed followed, if not caused, then at least heralded by Faust. Goethe himself was both scientist and poet, and he applied this genetic method in his scientific studies before elevating it into his poetic method. The spiritual culmination of this approach is the evolution of Mephisto, a process that required nearly 40 years to reach a form satisfactory to the poet. It may well be that this scene delayed the completion of the work and contributed to the fragmentary state of the early edition. It is truly the evolution scene of the poem, and it anticipates much that is yet to come, just as it reflects much that already exists. From this scientific standpoint, the work is to be viewed. Faust is understood as an inherent development, therefore moral indignation directed against him is misplaced. He has reached the denial of all moral foundation through his denial of truth, and the question becomes what will become of a man without a basis for moral obligation. Nor can it be said that Faust deliberately chooses evil. Rather, he unfolds into certain states, growing like a tree from its germ. His aspiration remains directed toward truth, and this is his preference, yet the very effort to attain it has destroyed it for him. His denial is not an act of will, but a consequence of his condition. He is not to be condemned. Instead, he must be viewed without passion or prejudice, with attention fixed on the central question: into what will the everlasting no, planted in a human soul, develop? Indignation must be set aside, while calm observation follows the unfolding step by step, not as judges but as witnesses. Moral and religious judgments lie outside Faust until he develops into harmony with them, which he will do in time if allowed to proceed. For now he must follow his own path, and is to be regarded as the natural evolution of a human soul in its successive stages. The character of Mephistopheles and his relation to Faust are, in general, drawn from the legend, which is essentially the history of these two figures in association. Yet the legend is also fused with the poet's own life. The mythical biography of Faust and Goethe's actual biography frequently converge, and Goethe himself recognized this in later years. The real counterpart to Mephistopheles in his own experience has been identified by Goethe as a companion named Merck, with whom he spent much time in youth during the formative period of the Faust legend in his imagination. This blending of early myth and lived reality was an essential element of his poetic creation. In a conversation recorded with Eckermann in the year 1831, Goethe remarks that Merck and I went always together, like Faust and Mephistopheles. In this sense, the poet was to a degree living his own myths. Merck, he explains, was not a creative nature. On the contrary, he had a decided negative tendency. Here already appears the germ of Mephisto's character. Even though the older Goethe sometimes tends to read his later thought back into his youth, the essential fact of Merck's influence remains. He was much more given to blame than to praise, and he instinctively sought out whatever would give him occasion to indulge this tendency. Truly, here stands the embodied no in a real personage. A further image appears in Goethe's more elaborate portrait of Merck in his autobiography, Book 12. This peculiar man had the greatest influence upon my life, and it may be added that he also influenced the greatest work of the poet's life, the Faust poem itself. He was an excellent businessman, could be a very agreeable companion, and born with much intelligence, he had acquired a great deal of knowledge, a figure resembling Mephisto again, smoothed and polished over by modern culture. Even his physical appearance is described in Mephistophelian tones, a long, lank form. Prominent was his sharp-pointed nose, and restless eyes that moved to and fro, giving him somewhat the look of a tiger. His character also contained a striking contradiction. Naturally upright, he had become embittered against the world, and he had an irresistible tendency to show himself a knavish wag, nay, even a rascal. This very contradiction is later recognized in Mephisto himself, and is even used by interpreters to split the character and the whole poem into opposing halves. Goethe describes the fascination such a personality held for him, even as one is enticed to associate with something dangerous, a true serpent-like charm. Thus the two were bound together, like Faust and Mephistopheles, by a psychic bond, if not by a formal pact sealed in blood. The later fate of Merck also appears significant. He entered marriage and found no happiness in it. Indeed, how could he? In the end he committed suicide, as if undoing himself and negating the negative in the last act of life, in the year 1891. Considerable philological debate has surrounded the origin of the name Mephistopheles, which appears to be a corrupted Greek compound. The Greek particle of negation and the word for love are suggested in its structure, though the middle element remains uncertain. Three interpretations are commonly noted. First, not loving light. Second, not loving Faust, with an older form of the name taken as Mephistopheles. And third, a connection with the term mephitic, referring to poisonous vapors arising from the earth in certain places, pools, caverns, or springs, vapors destructive to human life. The outcome of the previous scene is that Mephisto is now able to enter and leave Faust's study at will. The pentagram has been gnawed away and no longer obstructs him. It is not entirely destroyed, but it cannot hold him in and down, being broken on its inner side. Mephisto is now free, a real being in the world, and therefore capable of making a contract on equal terms. Earlier, as inner doubt and denial, he existed only in a shadowy, uncertain form. Now he has developed from a poodle into a person within Faust's study, and then into a person in the wider world, where he appears to move about in full freedom, which he clearly enjoys in his own manner. These changes carry deep significance, since they mirror spiritual changes within Faust himself. He has reached the stage where he begins to give reality to denial, granting it validity in the world, while at the same time denying all validity to thought in the world. Truth is false, yet the denial of truth is true. This contradiction is contained in the opening assertion. Man cannot know truth, but man can deny it and destroy it. thus his negative deed becomes real. The first internal form of denial in Faust has unfolded into the external form of Mephisto, who now proposes to lead him into a new realm. Faust could not receive guidance from truth. He must now accept the guidance of the devil. If the earlier scene generated Mephisto as an equal, this scene raises him into a superior position. He has just appeared as a free devil in a free world. Being free, he can bind himself through a contract, and being the equal of Faust, he can also gain the advantage in the bargain and rise from equality into superiority. Yet this superiority is of a special kind. By catering to Faust he directs and controls him, so that the servant becomes still more the master. Mephisto has, in effect, returned from the world into which he escaped through the broken point of the pentagram. How long he has been absent is a question that has troubled some critics at this stage, though it need not delay the present consideration, since in reading Faust one must rise above time. A more important question is what he has been doing in the world. Something diabolic, certainly, something consistent with his nature. This will reappear later, for the poem is universal and cannot exclude such a fact. Just as a Christian world has sounded into the scene through the Easter bells, so too there must be a devil's world outside the Faust chamber from which Mephisto has arrived. Again, Mephisto undergoes a series of changes, not so much in outward form as in character. He assumes new roles as he adapts himself to his purpose. In the previous scene there were metamorphoses of shape, from poodle into devil, with temptation through sensuous pleasure. In the present scene the outward form remains largely the same, while Mephisto changes his inner roles. It is inner transformation rather than external transformation. This difference arises from the situation itself. Mephisto has discovered that Faust is open to sensuous allure and can be lulled through the senses, but the question now is how to entice him while he is awake. The objective is settled, but the method must still be found. Mephisto now appears first as a fine gentleman in bright attire, no longer the dry scholastic, but a man of the world seeking to experience life, especially sensuous life. He proposes to become Faust's companion, and advises him to dress similarly and accompany him. Faust, however, is not in a good mood. How could he be, with the awareness of an escaped devil now returned to him in freedom? This differs greatly from the Easter mood, when he carried the love of God within him. Still, he must admit the presence of this figure, since the outer point of the pentagram is open and nothing remains to keep the devil out. Mephisto boldly announces himself, "It is me," and even compels Faust to invite him in 3 times. He is no longer the poodle slipping in unconsciously, but must now be admitted knowingly as devil, on equal terms with a man. The invitation must be repeated 3 times, for various reasons have been suggested. That 3 is a magical number, or that it relates to the Trinity as its mocking counterpart or forced recognition. In any case, the effect is that Faust is compelled to think before acting. He is not caught off guard by a single intrusion. He is fully aware of this diabolic return, acknowledges it, and cannot keep it out. The Prince of Darkness now appears in the form of a gentleman, and invites Faust to become his companion in the experience of life. In response, Faust delivers a harsh criticism of life, ending in a stark opposition. "Death I wish, life I hate." The reason is that life fulfills no desire in the daylight, while sending frightening dreams by night. It constantly repeats the demand, "Thou must renounce," placing limits on wishes and restricting aspiration. The old dualism returns. The God within my bosom can rouse my inmost spirit. The God throned above me can move nothing outwardly. There are thus 2 gods, inner and outer, locked in perpetual struggle, and life itself becomes their warfare. Faust again expresses that he cannot reach the truth of reality. There is intense desire but no fulfillment, a renewed conflict of the gods. His condition is also marked. He is too old to play with desire for mere pleasure, yet too young to exist without it. This marks another descent, though now he has the devil to bring him a mocking logic. "Why don't you kill yourself? Why did you not take that poison?" This taunt provokes a violent outburst, as though his life produced nothing but gall. It is known as Faust's curse. It extends over the entire spiritual and even material world of humanity. Mind, possessions, pleasures, even virtues such as faith and hope, which allow endurance of life, and finally even patience itself. Faust curses not only truth, which he cannot know, but also his own aspiration, not only life, but everything that makes life bearable, and most deeply, he curses himself. This is the final nature of the curse in both ancient Greek and modern understanding. It ultimately returns upon the one who utters it. As in the cases of Oedipus and Lear, the great cursers, Faust is already cursed within his own curse. Yet from this, he is still destined to be redeemed. Humanity itself is to be redeemed from its own curse. The deepest point of the malediction becomes the beginning of its reversal. The curse turns against itself and opens toward renewed aspiration. At this moment, invisible spirits are heard lamenting over this curse. Woe, woe, thou hast destroyed it, the beautiful world, which appears to be the very world contained in Faust's curse. The tone is not one of hatred, but of sympathy, and even hope. Again they speak, Mighty son of earth, more grandly build it up again, in thy bosom build it, begin thy new career, and new songs will make music to it. This command and promise rises through the ruins of the curse itself. The voice is unmistakable. Aspiration once more speaks to Faust, breaking forth as a gentle spirit song at the very edge of his despair. As before, it emerges at the extreme point of negation. The curse has turned upon itself and is fading, while a distant light is cast forward toward the end of the poem, where the beautiful world is to be rebuilt within Faust's own being. However, Mephisto seeks to prevent precisely this outcome. He immediately claims these spirits as his own and reinterprets their song according to his purpose. Yet many critics accept this claim and adopt his interpretation. In truth, they are deceived by the devil, the father of lies, who distorts the words of the spirits. These voices do not urge desire and deeds in the sense of sensuous indulgence. Rather, they call for the rebuilding of the beautiful world. Their lament over lost beauty is itself opposed to Mephisto, since he is its destroyer. Their exhortation is not for destruction, but for new construction, whereas the devil, by his own definition, stands for destruction. These are not evil spirits subject to Mephisto. Their essence is opposed to him. They are voices of aspiration rising from beneath the ruins of the curse. It is regrettable that some interpreters align themselves with the devil's distortion, misguiding others in the process. When one falls into such company, the proper response is to separate from it after exposing the error and urging correction. Mephisto therefore twists the meaning of the words in order to suppress the rising aspiration in Faust, or to redirect it into sensuous desire. Recognizing that companionship alone has not succeeded, he now attempts a different approach: service. His new proposal is as follows: If thou wilt go with me through life, step by step, thine I am on the spot, thy servant, thy slave. With this, Mephisto assumes his second role in the scene, that of the servant to Faust, continuing the series of transformations that now define his method. The devil, as a free person in a free world, is able to enter into a contract for his service. In other words, he demands a return for his effort, since, being an egoist, he does not work for nothing. Faust is also conscious that he must pay the price, or rather the penalty, for such service, and insists on knowing it immediately. The proposal may therefore be summed up briefly. Service in this life is exchanged for service in the beyond. Since this beyond is nothing to Faust, he accepts the agreement. It appears to be a good bargain, for the future state is the last unreality if man cannot know truth. Faust refuses even to hear further of that other world with its dreams, whether one hates or loves there, whether it has an above or below, and chooses instead to apply the contract to this life, here and now. The essence of the contract is this: when the devil is able to satisfy Faust's soul in its aspiration for truth through the gratification of his senses, then he may claim it. Yet in that case, it is already lost. Faust belongs to the devil just as much as if no compact had been made, as Mephisto himself later admits in his soliloquy. It is thus a subtle, double-edged agreement, striking the mortal from both sides, a true offspring of Satan, who seeks to win both here and beyond through a form of devilish trickery. Looking deeper into the thought, the two worlds, present and future, may be understood as one. Mephisto is to be Faust's servant here, in finite existence. Faust is to be Mephisto's servant beyond, in eternal life. Yet eternal life must itself be regarded as present, unfolding in the eternal now. Faust does not live in the future but in this now. Therefore, when he allows Mephisto to satisfy his senses in the present, he is in truth already his slave in the eternal sense. When Mephisto serves the sensual nature, he subdues the spiritual, and though he appears as servant in the particular, Faust becomes servant in the universal. By following the senses alone, he is drawn into destruction of the good and of the world order. Thus, by this contract, Faust is in truth bound here and beyond. This is the deep cunning embedded in the old Teutonic myth, and it reveals a truly devilish duplicity. But the central question remains: can the devil fulfill the condition? Can he satisfy Faust's intellectual longing through gratification of the senses? This is the real issue of the compact, and indeed of the entire work. Will indulgence silence the desire for truth? Faust, in a renewed impulse of aspiration, declares that Mephisto cannot even comprehend the lofty striving of the human spirit, let alone satisfy it. He dismisses pleasure as fruit rotten before it is plucked, though its tree may grow green again daily. He enters the contract without fear of its outcome. When I shall lay myself upon an idler's bed in peace, then let Mephisto take him. When through lying flattery he can make me satisfied with myself, or deceive me with enjoyment, then he may take him at once, for that shall be his last day. Faust is convinced that his aspiration can never be fulfilled by a life of pleasure alone. In the second part, at the moment of his death, Faust will address the passing moment. "Delay, thou art so fair," and Mephisto will immediately claim him, leading to a terrible struggle between demons and angels for Faust's immortal part, in which the infernal forces are defeated. In truth, the wager is not won by the devil. Faust reaches inner fulfillment not through indulgence, but through a new, world-embracing activity that ultimately overcomes the devil. At present, however, Faust enters upon the sensuous life, since it is all that remains after his previous experiences. Once again he falls into a state of denial and despair when recalling his failed attempts with the nature spirit and the earth spirit. The thread of thought is broken. Knowledge produces disgust, since it cannot reach truth. "I belong to thy rank only," he declares, acknowledging himself as the devil's. He therefore casts himself into the depths of sensuality to quiet his burning passion, hoping that some form of satisfaction may calm his longing heart, though he has little confidence in its success. He calls for every illusion and wonder to be ready within its unpierced veil of magic deception, as will later appear in the Witch's Kitchen and the Walpurgis Night. Two external elements are introduced in this contract and call for brief comment. Mephisto insists on a written document as proof of their agreement, but Faust dismisses all such papers as illusion, a spectre which everybody avoids. This follows directly from his denial of objective reality such as law or contract in law. Only honesty, pure in the bosom, meaning inward subjective feeling, has value for him, while the word dies in the pen once it leaves the soul. Secondly, the signature is required to be made with a drop of blood, described as a very peculiar juice, a symbol of life itself, which will be harmed as the document is torn. Life is therefore bound up with the breaking of the contract, and the signer is warned accordingly. In this strange symbolic form, the old legend expresses what is truly at stake in the compact, here understood as spiritual, touching life and death. Yet aspiration still survives in Faust, even in the moment when he seems almost lost in despair. From these depths, he in fact creates a kind of wings by which to rise again. He does not want pleasure alone, he also wants pain. He demands a total experience, not one-sided feeling but its opposite as well. He is willing to endure suffering and even bear the cross if necessary, to feel within himself what is allotted to the whole of mankind. He must have a totality, even in emotion if not in intellect. He expands his selfhood toward the selfhood of humanity, and if ruin is the outcome, he accepts it with it. In this way Faust forms a new kind of aspiration, which alarms Mephisto and forces him to shift into a deeper strategy. Faust, as always, keeps the devil fully engaged. This leads to the third transformation of Mephisto in the scene, where he appears as the destroyer of thought. He is no longer the scholastic theologian defining himself, but now resembles the modern philosopher who declares, "Do not think, abandon thought, sink the struggling intellect into the river of forgetfulness and be rid of it forever." At this stage, the text also recalls a major gap in the early fragment of the work, covering more than a quarter of the first part. That earlier portion contained the genesis of Mephisto as it had been gradually unfolding. Although conceived and partly written earlier, it was not yet fully mastered at that time. Only much later was it completed in the final edition. Thus a great leap occurs from the first denial of thought to the fully formed Mephisto as thought-destroyer. The connection between the original denial and this developed figure can still be sensed, even in fragmentary form. The whole toward which Faust aspires represents the universality of thought, and it stands as the true opposite of Mephisto, who is only a part. Mephisto at this stage corresponds to the understanding, which works with means toward finite, material ends. Faust, by contrast, represents reason, or rather its aspiration, which is dissatisfied with such limited ends and seeks to establish itself as the supreme end. Reason demands wholeness, whether of thought or at least of emotion, as Faust has just expressed. Mephisto must either suppress this demand or be undone by it. In Mephisto's view, this whole is merely old hard bread which mankind has chewed on for many thousand years, and not a soul has yet digested it. The familiar diabolic argument appears again. Because people disagree and fail to understand, the matter must be dismissed. This whole, he claims, would suit a god, not devils in darkness or mortals trapped in duality. The same claim persists in modern form, that truth can be known by God alone, not by man, though it is still the devil's suggestion whether spoken by scholar or preacher. Faust, however, answers firmly, declaring, "I will," and for a moment appears saved. Mephisto responds with mockery, dismissing the idea of a harmonious totality of opposing qualities as mere fantasy. For him, knowledge does not elevate the knower. No accumulation of details or traits makes one higher, and a person remains what he is. The implication is clear. No increase of particular knowledge leads to truth itself, for one may know many things and still remain ignorant, while knowing one true thing would be wisdom. Here the blow falls heavily upon Faust and strikes him down to the earth. It is his own conviction that man cannot know truth, and from this very conviction Mephisto has been generated. Faust's own denial now confronts him face to face and turns against his aspiration. He meets his own creation, and it crushes him with his own shibboleth. The everlasting no has returned to him in the form of the devil, and he breaks out in a cry of despair. "In vain I have gathered all the treasures of the human mind. I am not a hair's breadth higher, am not nearer the infinite." This is true, yet the infinite is not to be reached in that manner, not by piling up wigs of millions and millions of curls, as though intellectual accumulation could lead there. Otherwise the wig-block would be the best head, and the wig-maker the greatest philosopher. His own devil now strikes him with his own denial, and drives him away from his last ground of support with a new thunderword. Stop thinking, the supreme command of the devil. Go out into the world and use hands, feet, and bodily powers for enjoyment, even the strength of 6 stallions, if possible. The world is offered for sensuous gratification, and the appetite is already there. Above all, thinking must cease. The one who speculates is compared to a beast led in circles across a barren heath by an evil spirit, while nearby lies rich green pasture. This saying is often quoted approvingly as though it were a truth about thought, or even Goethe's judgment on philosophy. But it must be remembered who utters it. It is the devil, known as the father of lies and deceiver of mortals. Further reflection shows what this statement is intended to achieve. The devil is attempting to persuade Faust to surrender entirely to sensuality and to remove the main obstacle in his way. And finally, when the devil later reflects upon his own words, it becomes clear that he himself knows better and has lied knowingly in order to ensnare Faust, and in doing so has also ensnared others. Whatever Goethe's own opinion may be, the important point is to recognize the devil at work. Faust's intellectual world now lies in ruins, destroyed by a demonic force, and his practical world quickly follows in logical sequence. As a teacher, he is supposed to teach what he knows, but since he knows nothing, his vocation is gone. Mephisto therefore suggests immediate departure from this place of martyrdom, the schoolroom. Teaching, he says, has become nothing but pointless effort, straw threshing, and even the best knowledge cannot be spoken aloud to the pupils. That best thing, it is implied, has already been hinted at, and Mephisto will soon repeat it to a student. A new student is already waiting outside for admission. Faust, now stripped of his role as teacher, can only say that he cannot see him. His vocation is lost, and within a short time he must depart with Mephisto on a new journey into life. But Mephisto himself takes on the encounter. This is his opportunity for another blow. He puts on Faust's academic coat and cap, claiming that he will provide the wit himself. With this, another transformation occurs, the fourth in this scene. Mephisto has not only destroyed Faust's vocation, but has taken its place in order to corrupt the pupil's vocation as well. The expectation now is that he will present the shortest path to diabolism itself. Yet even here, condemnation must be withheld for the moment. The devil is to be observed with a certain understanding before judgment is passed. Mephisto, now installed as teacher in Faust's place and wearing his costume, becomes the central spectacle. He has developed into a free being in a free world, with a character entirely independent of Faust. He also speaks in his own soliloquy, where he turns inward and reflects on the Faust question. To others he may lie, but to himself he speaks truth, or what he takes to be truth. For even the devil has no interest in deceiving himself, and whatever his errors, must not deceive himself. In this inner speech he declares, "Despise but reason and science, man's all highest power. Follow but the delusion and magic of the spirit of lies. Then I shall have thee unconditionally. No contract is even required." The emphasis falls on carefully chosen terms. Reason, not mere understanding, but the faculty that grasps wholes and truth. Science, not subjective opinion, but truth as it exists in the world. The message is simple. Despise the human capacity for knowing truth, and truth itself, and thou art already his. If he had not subscribed himself to the devil, still he must perish. The contract is therefore only an outward form, since its inner essence is already complete. Whoever commits himself to the devil is already his without any agreement. It is again made clear that Mephisto is fully self-knowing. His deception of Faust is conscious and intentional, and must be so if he is to be the devil. He defines Faust as an infinitely striving spirit, one that seeks satisfaction only in thought. If it renounces thought and turns to pleasure, it is lost. Thus when Mephisto earlier advised, "Stop thinking," he was not mistaken but fully aware that this is the path to ruin. He is the devil precisely because he persists knowingly in destruction. He is a self-conscious villain. Unlike Faust, he has no aspiration toward truth, though he knows of it. Faust does not know truth but seeks it. Mephisto knows of it but rejects it and seeks to destroy it. This is the meaning of Mephisto's soliloquy, in which he praises reason after having condemned it before the Lord in the prologue in heaven, and in which he openly acknowledges himself as deceiver and destroyer. Commentators have struggled with this passage, unable to understand how the devil can recognize his own evil. Some explain it away by claiming Mephisto steps outside his role and speaks Goethe's opinion. Others see contradiction between earlier and later depictions of him. But the difficulty lies not in the poet. Rather, this soliloquy is the key that completes Mephisto's character. It shows him as one who knows the better but does the worse, not a figure of blind impulse, but a malicious intelligence acting with intention. Without knowledge of reason and science as the highest good, he could not be the devil at all. The monologue is therefore essential. It establishes him as a self-conscious agent of evil, choosing it deliberately. Without this, Mephisto would dissolve into inconsistency and become unintelligible. The poet, it is implied, understands the construction of the devil better than his critics, Mephisto now appears explicitly as teacher. A new student approaches to receive instruction, a figure resembling the young Faust himself, marked by freedom of spirit, love of nature, and an unlimited aspiration for knowledge. I would like to know what is in heaven and on earth. The maternal hesitation that tries to hold him back is noted as a genuine instinct, foretelling concern for his future path. Before this student, Mephisto describes the German university tradition in purely negative terms, carefully omitting any positive value. The account is delivered with satire and humor, so much so that it is often mistaken for Goethe's own judgment on university education. But the question arises whether these are Goethe's views or Mephisto's. They are Mephisto's and must be understood as part of his character, even if they may echo the poet's earlier impressions from his own academic experience. In any case, the final judgment belongs to Mephisto's voice. The first subject treated is logic, presented as empty formalism and the foundation of hollow knowledge, and it is dismissed in a burst of sarcastic ridicule characteristic of Mephisto himself. Mephisto now delivers, in advance, an account of the four faculties, already hinted at in the opening of the poem. All knowledge is thereby condemned beforehand for the student. First comes philosophy, reduced to nothing more than a fine word for what enters, or does not enter, the brain. Jurisprudence is next dismissed as an eternal sickness passing from generation to generation, while the natural right of man is ignored. Theology is also judged as containing much hidden poison, and its safest practice is said to be to hold fast to words and swear by the words of the master. In this rejection runs the familiar revolt of youth against age, of free unformed aspiration against fixed and organized reality. The fourth faculty, medicine, is then introduced. Here Mephisto shifts tone and, as he says, will play the devil aright, offering something positive. Medicine as a science is declared worthless. One studies through both the great and small worlds only to leave everything finally to divine will. But as practice, it opens a path to sensuality. One is advised, above all, to learn control over women, and the nature of that control is left unmistakably implied. At this point the student is struck and exclaims that this looks better, since at least one sees where and how things stand. Mephisto confirms the impression with a biblical-sounding remark. The green golden tree of life is preferable, whereas theory, or the tree of knowledge, is grey and obscure. The student thus makes rapid progress under Mephisto's guidance. In a short time he rejects the knowledge of all four faculties, a conclusion that cost Faust years of effort. Even more, he chooses medicine for practical life precisely because it offers opportunities aligned with Mephisto's spirit, thereby becoming, in effect, a Mephisto without long preparation. In this way both Faust and the student now fall under Mephisto's influence, and the cycle of the poem turns back toward its beginning, showing the young Faust-like figure long before the first soliloquy, with Mephisto already as teacher. The student's vocation is destroyed and his youth diverted, confirming the thesis that man cannot know truth. Such instruction, however, is not confined to the past. It continues in the present in schools and universities. The alleged unknowability of knowledge is still preached, and even from those who claim to think, the command is heard, "Do not think." Mephisto appears again in pedagogical disguise, speaking from the professorial chair, writing books, delivering lectures, and demonstrating through reasoning that there is no reasoning. Intellect is made to deny itself, and in this lies a key insight. Mephisto is ultimately self-destructive, though in the process he attempts to drag others into the same ruin, often successfully. The rejection of intellect again leads directly to surrender to the senses. Before departing, the student requests a motto for his album, as a lasting reminder of the encounter. Mephisto assumes his traditional role as deceiver of innocence, echoing the Eden narrative with its promise, "Ye shall be as God, knowing good and evil." Yet once the student has gone, Mephisto reflects in a brief soliloquy that he knows the better while advising the worse. The forbidden fruit of indulgence is again recommended, with the ancient serpent's promise of divine likeness, though that likeness is in truth only sorrow. Thus Mephisto remains fully conscious in his deception, otherwise he would not be the devil. He must know truth in order to deny it, though he refuses to align himself with it or aspire toward it. In this way his character becomes fully defined and distinct from Faust, from whom he originated. The creation, for the moment, surpasses its creator and exercises mastery over him. Faust has generated his own master, who will dominate the next stage of the poem until he in turn is brought down. Each, Faust and Mephisto, appears as the shadow, yet as the inverted shadow of the other. The one aspires for truth, though he does not know it. The other knows it, though he does not aspire for it, but for the lie and the bad. The one, with sound heart but perverted head, is man, full of error in his wandering toward heaven. The other, with sound head but corrupted heart, is the devil, full of malice on his way to hell. They must be seen as counterparts, two sides of one great world character, which, when its dualism is overcome, may be called the complete Faust, where intellect and aspiration are reconciled, and the head and heart of man, like the head and heart of God, are no longer discordant but become the two grand notes of one universal harmony. The student departs as a graduate of Mephisto's university for the moment, though the poet will later take him up again in the second part and assign him another role. Faust returns to Mephisto, no longer as teacher or thinker, for such a vocation has vanished. Instead, he is now to be a traveller and sightseer, looking upon the large and little worlds. He feels himself poorly prepared, yet we need only spread out our cloak. Clothes make people, as the saying goes, and Mephisto is master of appearances. Then comes a little fire air, and they rise as if in a balloon. A new career has opened to Faust, and with it a new chapter begins. At this point a disputation scene was discarded as unnecessary, for what could it achieve? The scholastic devil has already been heard sufficiently, defining himself as evil and proving disagreeable to Faust. Further argument would change nothing, and so it is removed. This decision reveals something of the poet's method. He had a plan or idea, and excluded everything that did not belong to it. The work is not a chaotic sequence of layers, but an ordered structure arranged by thought rather than by mere growth in time. To grasp it, one must seek this guiding thought. In this scene 4 stages in the development of Mephisto have been passed through, each carrying Faust along with it. First, Mephisto appears as a gay companion in life, but even in life's bitterest curse there remains a spark of hope, which unconsciously awakens aspiration, and from Faust's despair arises the song of the spirits. Second comes the pact, in which Mephisto offers himself as slave to provide means of indulgence, while Faust accepts but demands a whole of emotion, both pain and pleasure. Third, Mephisto turns against this whole, which rests on thought, and becomes thought-destroyer, thereby destroying Faust's vocation as a teacher of thought. Fourth, once Faust is emptied of vocation, Mephisto assumes it himself in order to destroy the pupil as well, bringing him down to Faust's present condition without years of study or struggle. Having thus secured control by destroying both Faust's theoretical and practical life, Mephisto leads him into the world, which is suspected to be his own realm of indulgence. This world of Mephisto now becomes central. Earlier he had escaped from Faust by gnawing off the inner point of the pentagram. Whither he went is uncertain, but he must have had or created a home outside. Now it is known where he goes. He returns to the world he has shaped, and will conduct Faust into it for either good or bad experience. This is the second time Faust is enticed into the world. The Easter bells once restrained him from the final leap into the beyond, and sent him into a holiday world, where he saw Christendom. But rejecting its Christian element, he embraced its sensuous side, which returned to him in the form of the poodle. From this animal Mephisto emerged. Now Mephisto leads him into a second reality, not a Christendom founded on suppression of appetite, but a devildom founded on gratification. Faust is therefore leaving behind internal brooding and speculation and entering the external world. This realm stands in contrast to his earlier inwardness and is divided into the little and great worlds. These are not the inner microcosm already explored in thought, but divisions of the external macrocosm. The rest of the poem is broadly arranged into 2 parts, one concerned with family and civil life, extending to the end of the first part, the other with state and court life, forming the second part. This distinction marks the movement from subjective to objective existence. The reader is thus led into a new career unfolding through the remainder of the work.